and fellow Canadians that follow this meeting live today. Welcome to meeting number 29 of the Special Joint Committee on the Declaration of Emergency, which was established pursuant to the orders of the House of Commons and the Senate of March 2nd and 3rd, 2022. Today's public meeting is being held in a hybrid format in accordance with Senate and House of Commons orders. Member of Parliament Nakvi, I'd like to point out that a sound test was carried out with Mr. Nakvi, who attends a meeting via video conference, and the clerk has confirmed that everything is in working order. In the event of a technical problem, please let me know so that we can suspend the meeting for a few minutes to allow all members to participate fully. This evening we have two panels. In each panel, we will hear from the witnesses and then follow with question and answer with the members of the Joint Committee. I will now introduce our first panel, and I wish to welcome from the Translation Bureau, Jean-Francois Limburger, the Chief Executive Officer, Matthew Ball, Vice President Services to Parliament and Interpretation, Annie Plouffe, Acting Vice President Policy and Corporate Services, and Julie Poivrier, Acting Vice President Linguistic Services. And from the Privy Council Office, Mr. Matthew Shea, Assistant Secretary to the Cabinet, Ministerial Services and Corporate Affairs, and Alexander Freeland, Acting Director General, Data and Information Services Directorate. I remind our witnesses that you will each be given 5 minutes for your opening remarks, and we'll start those remarks from the Privy Council Office representatives to be followed by the Translation Bureau. Please go ahead.
Good evening, Joint Chairs and members of the committee. Je vous remercie d'avoir invité le...
Thank you for inviting us to come and discuss the translation of testimony.
Assistant Secretary to the Cabinet for Ministerial Services and Corporate Affairs at PCO. As mentioned, I'm joined by my colleague Alexander Freeland, who is in charge of our information management services at PCO. The Public Order Emergency Commission was established by an order in Council on April 25, 2022 to conduct an independent public inquiry in accordance with the Emergencies Act. Le BCP est actuellement le gardien des documents.
We currently are custodians of the Commission's official records as they existed at the conclusion of the Commission's mandate on March 31st, 2023. We are maintaining the Commission's website for at least 1 year and are coordinating with Library and Archives Canada to transfer the Commission's records for preservation.
The committee's interest in these records as part of its important role under the Emergencies Act. We are committed to supporting this committee. I am here today to discuss the complexity of the issue and our interest in and willingness to find a solution that would best support this committee's work. Au cours de ces activités, la Commission a communiqué.
During its operations, the Commission communicated with and provided services to the public in both official languages.
Final report of more than 2,000 pages available in both official languages. It summarizes the documents, interviews, and evidence that the Commission examined during its investigation. The majority of the information created by the Commission was disseminated on its website and is also available in both official languages. L'approche de la Commission était conforme.
The Commission's approach was consistent with other commissions and with that required by federal courts under Part 3 of the Official Languages Act, where evidence can be filed in either official language.
Provided the committee with two tables summarizing the number of files that we have received from the Commission. However, we recognize that an itemized list of documents may be more helpful to this committee. Since that time, we have created a working copy of the Commission's collection for analysis and have been able to get a more accurate count of the total number of files. We can prepare itemized lists for certain categories of documents, such as the evidence submitted by the Government of Canada, as well as evidence published on the Commission's website, if the committee believes that this would be helpful for its important work. Le BCP serait
PCO would be happy to continue working with the committee to identify sets of documents that could be submitted for translation in phases. We are committed to respecting Canada's official languages and to providing committee members with information to support their work.
Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you again today. I look forward to answering your questions alongside my colleagues from Public Services and Procurement Canada.
Thank you very much. And we'll now move to Mr. Lindberger.
Bonsoir, bonsoir, Madame la Présidente.
Hello, Madam Chair, honorable members of the committee. I'd like to acknowledge that we are gathered on the traditional territory of the Algonquin people. Joining me today are Annie Plouffe, Acting Vice President, Policy and Corporate Services, and Matthew Ball, Vice President, Services to Parliament and Interpretation. Thank you for inviting us to appear before you today on behalf of the Translation Bureau. Ever since its creation 90 years ago in 1934, the Translation Bureau has played a key role in upholding the equality of status and the equal rights and privileges accorded to English and French in the Canadian Constitution.
Our translators translate your reports and minutes, and our interpreters make it possible for you to hold your session in both official languages. And I will take this opportunity to thank Tatiana Pocklington, Najet Glenza, and Anaïs Haynes, who are interpreting this very important session today. Since 1995, the federal government, departments, and agencies have had the option of doing business with other suppliers for translation. Nevertheless, the Bureau still remains the primary supplier of translation, interpretation, and terminology services in both official languages, as well as indigenous languages, foreign languages, and sign languages. Bien sûr que nos 700
Of course, our 700 or so translators, about 100 of whom do parliamentary translation, don't work on their own. In 2022-23, we outsourced approximately a large volume of our business to the private sector. This allows us to translate each year for Parliament and the government almost 380 million words, or 1.4 million pages. We also use technology such as machine translation, AI, to increase our capacity while making sure that the output is revised by a qualified translator to guarantee quality. Our focus on ensuring both efficiency and quality makes the Translation Bureau a partner of choice, especially for large, complex projects such as the translation of documents for the Rouleau Inquiry.
I can confirm, Madam Chair, that the Translation Bureau provided to the Privy Council Office with cost estimates in the fall of 2023. I'd like to give you an idea of the scope of the work involved. Translating all the Rouleau Inquiry document, as mentioned in this committee, would take several years of work for the Translation Bureau. Even the last request for an estimate that we receive for the translation of only a portion of the documents involve about 124,000 pages and an estimate at a cost of $16 million. Certains facteurs liés à ce projet rendront le processus de...
Other factors would make this extremely complex. The legal tenor means that we would have to find specialized translators. Some of the documents are also handwritten, which would mean that we would have to manipulate them before dealing with them. Some of the documents are also classified, which means that we could not use non-secure tools such as machine translation or our private sector suppliers. Not to mention that simply managing these millions of pages of documents would require a huge amount of work on its own. Madam Chair.
Is explanation helpful? Since you began your work, the Translation Bureau has been there to support you, just as we supported the Rouleau Inquiry. Our legal translators were also there to translate Justice Mosley's decision, and we have the expertise you need, and will continue to be available whenever you require high-quality linguistic services. My colleagues and I are now ready to answer your question. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. According to the motion we adopted on Tuesday, April 5th, we will begin our first round. That'll be a 5-minute round, and we will begin with Mr. Motz.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you so much for Translation Bureau and PCO officials for being here. It is really appreciated, and it's something that we've been working toward hearing from you personally for some time. Now, in the correspondence to the committee, I believe, the PCO, you mentioned that there were approximately 265,000 records representing about 152,000 unique documents that were tabled before the Review Commission. Now, the Commission only posted about 8,900 of those on their website, which means you guys did that, PCO did that, correct?
We worked with them. They ran their website.
Okay, fair enough.
Now, possession.
So can you explain to the Canadian public who might be asking why the Reload Commission had access to 143,000 documents that which Canadians never existed? Now, I understand some of them might be sensitive in nature or, as indicated otherwise, but why they don't have access to them today, and whether you as the PCO can determine what status they're at, what exists, like what are those documents are, and why they haven't been able to be accessed by Canadians.
So thank you very much for your question. Perhaps I'll give a little bit of context in terms of our role and the role of the Commission. So during the Commission, they're completely independent. They run their information management. They run their internal email. We provide support. We provide them systems, and we provide them advice. At the end of a commission, effectively, we're handed those files in electronic form, paper form, but there's not necessarily a lot of information about what's in the individual files. So to actually know what's in them, we'd have to open them, kind of go through them, and make some determinations. At a high level, what I can tell you is that within the 152,000 documents that you mentioned, there's a mix of, I'd say, 4 broad categories. There's the documents that the Government of Canada provided, and that could be a mix of cabinet confidences, top secret information, and protected B information. That's about 31,000 unique files. In addition to that, there were 88,000 files that were productions from other parties. And so, as you know, there were a number of parties withstanding who submitted documents. And so this is the documents that were submitted by, whether it be provinces or police services or independent citizens that are contained in there. In addition, there's the individual documents that have been created by the Commission itself. And so there's 22,000 files that we have determined that were created by the Commission itself. And then there's internal documents. Think of HR, finance, those internal administrative documents, about 11,000. And so in keeping with what's been done in past commissions, there's a website created by the Commission with the final report and the information that it deems the public should have access to. Just like any... And the Commission makes that determination.
Okay, thank you.
And then,
so I have limited time.
I apologize.
And I appreciate some of that. I want to get to kind of something that you said in your testimony that I found very helpful. So at our committee meeting last meeting, a couple of weeks ago, we adopted a motion respecting the prioritization of document translation requests. Now, that motion was left somewhat open-ended, so we could benefit from your testimony today. So I was pleased to hear that you had some suggestions on what you've done already to help us as a committee determine what documents we might need, what might not need. And can you explain that a little bit further for us? I know you just brushed over it, but you've created a catalog, some items that you think would be important for our deliberations today. Can you just explain that a bit further for us, please?
What we've tried to create is a bit of a sense of what's in those documents. And so I gave you those 4 large categories. Within that, we can give subcategories of the types of documents. We have found that we have the ability, depending on the database used, so that the government documents are in what's called Ringtail, which is a legal software that we use for many different purposes. It's quite easy for us to determine what's in those documents. We would still have to review some of them before releasing them for reasons that you appreciate. In the other documents that are contained in other types of databases, what we can find is a file name, potentially the number of pages. We are finding generally the file name would be, email to so-and-so or document related to X. And so we think that could be helpful to the committee if they were to see information like that.
In an index. You're talking about some sort of an index.
An index
what
defined
specifically?
a certain way.
Okay, fair enough. Now, you're talking the 8,000 some documents what's in the that are on the website? Or are you talking a broader range?
So the 8,000 on the website would be evidence that was submitted in one language or another. We know what that is. We can translate that. We've told you what the cost is. In addition, for the other documents within the 152,000, we believe we could work with the committee to come up with at least a list of this is what the documents are. And
I think it'll come out in other evidence. Member of Parliament, Mr. Nakvi, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and I want to thank the witnesses there. The gentleman from PCO, sorry, I can't remember your name right now. Can you just finish your thought? I want to make sure that we hear your answer.
I appreciate the opportunity to finish the thought. We could give these file names. We believe in some cases they would be quite helpful in determining what's in the document, and you may select of that 152,000, perhaps there's only 5,000 that are truly of interest, and then we can focus our attention on translating and reviewing those documents rather than this really large group of documents that, as my colleague mentioned, would take years and large amounts of taxpayer-funded contributions to be able to translate. So our goal is really to help you narrow down where you would like to focus attention and then to do everything we can to get that to you in an expedited fashion. It's worth noting that those individual titles are not written in both official language. We are open to whatever this committee would like us to do. We truly do want to find a solution that supports the work of this committee, but in a timely manner and not years from now.
So, Mr. Chair, just to follow up on that suggestion that you're making, how long would that process take in your estimation?
I think the main question, and I'm not asking for an answer clearly here, would be whether it needs to be translated. I think if it didn't need to be translated, we think we could do it relatively quickly. We're talking within weeks. We would want to kind of go through that, do a quick check to make sure that there's no titles that have, for example, personal confidential information that we need to be cognizant of. And so I think we still have to do a little bit of due diligence, but I think we could do it quickly. If translation is involved, we would need to work with our colleagues. We're talking 152,000 lines of information, extrapolate out. It's probably months and certainly not weeks for us to get that translated. And so we are completely open to what this committee would like, respecting the fact that you have every right to ask for it translated if that is what you would like.
Great, thank you. Well, the translation piece is important. I mean, I'm really proud of the fact that I belong to a political party that for which bilingualism is a very important aspect of who we are as Canadians. So I appreciate what you're saying. My question is, have you seen a request like this before? Is this quite unique in terms of the work you do, both from a PCO perspective and from Translation Bureau's point of view?
Speaking for PCO, I've now supported 4 commissions of inquiry, and I'm supporting the current commission of inquiry into foreign interference. I have never seen a request to get all documents. As I mentioned, our role is really just providing arm's length support. We happen to hold on to these documents until they go to the archivists at Library and Archives Canada so that the public, the media, and others can access them after review. It just so happens that we've received this request at a time that we're the holders of the document, and therefore it's our responsibility to respond. So it is unique in that respect. I cannot recall, certainly in my 6 years doing this role, a request like this, and that is why we look at this as unique, and we're looking for unique solutions to the issue at hand.
And from Translation Bureau's perspective?
Very much, Madam Chair, for the question. That's a very good point. From a commission standpoint, it's exactly what my colleague from PCO is saying. But I can also report that since 2020, we've seen a significant increase in the number of words being asked for translation from the Parliament. Just since 2020, about 30% of increase. There's other work in committees that is also coming out with large requests as we speak, and we're supporting all of these. It depends in this case if it's, like I mentioned in my opening remark, the Translation Bureau, it's like operating in a 2 business model. So for the Parliament, we're offering services to committees. When it comes down to departments, then we are working independently with departments, so depending on where the documents are coming from. But by and large, there is a significant increase, almost by 30% since 2020. Merci.
So if we look at the 2 options that is before us, one is on the track that we are on, which is to have all documents translated, and the other that's been suggested by Mr. Shea from PCO. For either one of them, can you share with us what kind of impact that would have on your existing workload in terms of supporting the Parliament, its committees, in terms of additional work or requirements for staff or personnel?
So if it's from a translation bureau perspective, I believe that we provided, when we provided our quotes, like Mr. Shea said, it was mentioned several times in the committee, the index, but in fact it was 124,000 document, and we provided a quote of 10 months. The only thing I would like to add, Madam Chair, is we can provide document as we translate them. So if there's a prioritization, that's something that we can work with as well.
Okay, thank you. We'll now move to Mr. Fortin.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Berner, Mr. Ball, Ms. Plouffe, Mr. Shea, Ms. Freeland, thank you for being here. We hadn't heard from you before today, but we had lots of questions following the letters we received from you over the past few months. Mr. Shea, when you say this is the first time you're in this kind of situation, does that mean that usually in commissions of inquiry there's no translation? The documents are used and they are not translated?
Pour donner un petit peu de...
To give you a few more details, there are several different kinds of documents. So for documents that are provided to the public, they have to be translated. But for internal documents, it's not the same.
Example, under the order in council, the final report had to be translated. The public...
Mais moi, je parle juste de la preuve, là.
I'm just talking about evidence here. Commissioner Rouleau, I'm convinced, speaks English and French perfectly well. And it's possible that his staff also speaks both official languages, but not necessarily. But when these people draft documents, it seems to me they should be able to correctly understand the body of evidence before them. So is there any time when someone says, and maybe this is for the Translation Bureau, listen, we've just heard from this witness, we need a version in the other official language. Is that something that happens? Mr. Limburger might be able to answer.
Si je peux répondre.
Madam Chair, if I may, I can answer this question. We received a request for translation and for interpretation at the Rouleau Commission. The Rouleau Commission also dealt with the private sector for some portions of their work. So they especially requested our help for specialized services, especially when you're dealing with secured documents or confidential documents. We did offer many services to them, but we didn't translate all those documents. Okay, so can you tell us approximately how many documents were translated for the Commission? Maybe I can ask Madame Plouffe. Thank you, Madam Chair. The number of documents that we translated, it was some of the chapters of the Rouleau report. Given my time is limited, we know the decision exists in both languages. I would like to focus on the evidence. Which part of the evidence was translated by the Translation Bureau? Do you have an idea? To my knowledge, we did not translate any of the evidence. And you didn't translate any of the witnesses either? Their testimony? I mean, I know that you did provide interpretation, but you didn't have to translate any stenographer's notes, for example. Exactly. So we know that the Rouleau Commission worked with the documents and the testimony, the language that they were provided, without translation, either translation into English or into French. If I may, Madam Chair, we can't presume that because, as Mr. Limburger said, the Commission dealt with private firms, so the Translation Bureau can't tell you to what extent they worked with translated documents. Is it possible to know which private firms the Rouleau Commission dealt with for translation? Madam Chair, I don't have that information. Mr. Shea?
Verify whether they used any private translation. I'm not aware that they did, but they may have, as parts of the final report, just due to the time crunch, they may have used some private translation. But I would just reiterate, their obligations under the Official Languages Act are for the external documents, the documents that they put on their website, the documents that they release to the public, and of course the hearings, just like today, had to have interpretation, and we had to have translation of the documents. Internal documents, just like the Government of Canada, can be in either official language. And so it is worth noting, given we haven't looked through every single email, we are assuming that it's translation from English to French. The reality is there will also be some translation from French to English, as you point out.
Monsieur.
Sorry, the time is up, Mr. Fortin.
Merci.
5 minutes? 5 minutes, Mr.
The
Green.
time goes by fast.
It
I have to
does.
say, in all my time, I haven't had the pleasure, Mr. Limburger or folks from interpretation and translation, to be here. And I just want to say right off the top that in all my time in Parliament, your interpretation services, translation services, the things that help us stay bilingual are world class. I've traveled around, I've gone to other conferences where they had it, but certainly our interpretive services are world class, and I just wanted to say that off the top. I'm trying to get a better understanding, though, just in terms of the scope. And I think if I could perhaps make one admission of guilt in this committee, is I wish perhaps we had consulted with you prior to really voting on the motion that ultimately would have sent this volume of documents for translation. I think in fairness to us at the time, we weren't even sure ourselves just how much it was we were dealing with, but we made the best decision with the information we had. So with that being said, Mr. Limburger, in terms of the scope of work, if you could just give us a bit of an understanding, and for the public that are watching, roughly how many staff members would you have working in translation services?
Yep. So, Madame la Présidente, so as I mentioned, totally at the Translation Bureau, we translate about 350 million words a year. That's for the entire translation across the government, including Parliament. And then when we do have 700 translators, and 100 of those are assigned to the work of the Parliament per se. Of course, for these type of requests, we have to augment our staff, not only through the people that are under Mr. Ball here who are there to support you. We're also looking elsewhere in the Translation Bureau, the people that are offering other services to augment. As we mentioned, again, we are just operating based on the request for quote that we got, so we haven't seen the document. I want to be prudent here, but this is why we've said 424,000 pages. We've estimated the work for 10 months, and that's taking into consideration all the other work that we're doing for other committees that is currently going.
And I did recall you making an analysis, but for my sake, you have to maybe break it down even more simplistically. Yeah. How many people and how many person hours would that look like in terms of the time?
So I'll turn to Madame Plouffe just for the number of hours per se that a translator can do. But one thing I would like to clarify is not only when the document comes in, the translation doesn't start immediately. Of course, we have to receive the document. You probably have all seen that a lot of document contains pictures, graph, all kinds of tabulation. So there's a team, the project management team, they're trying to assess what needs to be done in the document before it goes to the translator. So we do have a team of people that are making sure that the pre-production is being done. So in our quote, not only we have the time of the translator, Madam Chair, we also have the time of the people that will have to unpack. And as we mentioned, more and more, the volume that we see, we're getting social media, video, handwritten stuff, pictures, screen grab. So the format is getting more and more complex before we can pass it on to a translator who can use the translation, the automation, and the tool to do their work. At the end, depending on the type of document, we also have a quality control check that is being done on those documents. So that's kind of the chain of work before the document comes back to you.
And while I appreciate that, if we could we maybe get a scope on what that looks like? Because what I'm trying to do is get a sense for you have your regular complement that are delegated to Parliament. What was the ask? I want to know what was it that we asked of you over and above that, and what that would look like kind of as a percentage of your regular work.
Thank you for the question, Madam Chair. So in terms of hours, we've calculated that to translate the 124,000 pages, that's our final estimate that we've provided, it would take us 160,000 hours. So if we do it all in one shot, to be able to do that. That also represents about, with all the force of the Translation Bureau, including our freelancers, 1 month of work. So we suspend everything and we do it with 1 month.
Let's be fair. It would be impossible to suspend everything.
Exactly.
And so if you were to just give me the snapshot in terms of pure numbers, what would it look like to do that? Number of workers.
The number of workers, I don't have the exact number of workers, but I can get
How many freelancers do you typically engage? Because you said your regular numbers plus your freelancers.
So we have 252 contracts in place right now that we use when we need to. And work like this, usually, depending on the types of documents, we will have a different contract. So, and that 252,000, contracts will help us do about half of our work annually. So they produce 60 million words per year.
Okay. And forgive me again, like I'm 5. I got 20 seconds, right? No? I got it here, 50. 700 plus 250, is that rough? Like we're talking about like 950 employees who'd be working on this for a month.
No, I would say contracts. It's more than that.
I see.
It depends, because some firms we will have access to tens of translators. So it really depends, and also depends on their availability.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Green. Will you take the chairs?
Happily, I got my little timer right here for you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to follow up on Mr. Green's points. I'm particularly interested in understanding impact, because we can say we can do it a number of ways, but I'm trying to figure out as you go into the next few months how that impacts the Translation Bureau, given that you're probably anticipating outside of this committee a large number of documents coming through. Are you going to just give me a sense of that?
Madam Chair, I'm not sure I understand the actual question, but I'm going to try to answer it. So what you're trying to understand the scope of the work? And so right now we would have 600 of our translators that would be available to work on that, presuming that we don't do the rest of the work, and we would capitalize on our contracts and freelancers to be able to do that. But as we've evaluated the work that we have, without any recourse to any artificial intelligence, because we do not have the format of the documents, presuming that these are not classified, so we're not talking about secret, we feel that we'd be able to do it in about 10 months. The 124,000 pages without major impact or changing any of the impacts we have on the rest of our operations.
So for giving this committee your best advice, giving all things considered, perhaps narrowing the scope might be of benefit to getting some of the work done sooner. Would that be?
Maybe I can answer that, Madam Chair. That's a very good point. As I mentioned, and I've listened to the previous committee, there was reference to an index, a table des matières, but in fact, what we spoke to you about today is for the entire documents that need to be translation. So if there's a prioritization exercise that can be done, would be extremely helpful, and then we could prioritize. The only thing I would add from Madame Plouffe comment, as I mentioned, we can use the support of the private sector for documents that are not classified. And I understand that a lot of those documents may be classified at a certain level.
Okay, thank you. And for Mr. Shea, can you explain how the translation of documents carried out by the Public Order Emergency Commission met the Official Languages Act standard?
The translation was for external-facing documents, and so their website, everything but the evidence, and I understand that is in keeping with the Evidence Act, was translated in both official languages. The report itself was in both official languages, and interpretation was provided for all of the individual events. I cannot speak to They are a federal organization. They have internal obligations as well. I can't speak to whether they adhere to all those because I was not there in terms of managing their employees and those pieces. But in terms of the external facing, everything that I've seen implies that they have met their obligations. If I could add one precision to what my colleague said, the $16 million quote that I think we just quantified as 10 months is for 8,000 documents. It's for the evidence that is on the website that was in one language to translate it. That is already a subset of the 152,000 files. And so if one was to extrapolate out, it's the same number of pages, and we don't know that until we look, multiply that by 19. And that's why we said in our first letter, over 300 million in many years is because you see the cost. And that is why from the start I've been saying we would really like to find a solution that allows us to narrow that down in a way that is acceptable to this committee.
I just have about a minute left. There was, and I'm not sure who mentioned it, the use of AI, and this has been raised before at this committee as to what degree AI helps. Could you just explain how that works?
I will turn to the experts at the Translation Bureau to explain how they use AI.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Madam Chair. I made the reference to automation and automated translation. We hear a lot of comments about artificial intelligence at the Translation Bureau. Would like to remind the members that since the 70s, the Translation Bureau used the dictaphone, one of the first organization. We were also one of the first organization to use word processing device in the 80s. And obviously, we're looking at every possibility to use the automation or artificial intelligence. The complexity comes when we need to move into the secret environment, where, of course, we cannot tap on all the information that is available. That being said, the AI is not perfect yet. Things like the receiver general might mean something for some, might be something in the football world. So we really need to make sure that there's experts that are going through. So yes, it's helping us to go a little bit faster in certain documents. In the classified, I'm not saying that we're not going to get there, working with Shared Service Canada and other partners to try to leverage the intelligence. Other countries, as mentioned by another member, obviously are facing the same challenges. And as long as it is safe to do it, we're going to use it.
Okay.
Provided it doesn't impact any collective agreement work. Here we go. Back to you.
Thank you very much. We'll move to Senator Carignan. 5 minutes.
Moi, je vous écoute, là.
I've been listening to you, and I am very impressed. I am very impressed by Justice Rouleau, how he managed to read all the evidence and deliberated over 2 months to draft his report. He is an exceptional man. And it's worth repeating that. Now, looking at the list of documents from the PCO, you mentioned this. Now, there are lots of lawyers in the room. When a piece of evidence is presented, it is added into the record. Is there anyone at the Rouleau Commission who was working on that and taking note of the language it was presented in?
I'm not sure I fully understand the question. They were responsible for managing the evidence and managing how it was archived. My understanding from legal experts, and I do not claim to be one, is that that information is not required to be translated in keeping with the Evidence Act.
Mais au-delà du fait que ça soit traduit ou non, il y a quelqu'un qui...
But beyond whether it was translated or not, someone was looking at the list of evidence, right? I mean, how were they doing that?
That evidence is actually on the website and available for public consumption. It is just not translated on the website. And so absolutely somebody was managing that, and somebody managed all the information which was transferred to us. But it was not necessarily transferred to us into a format that can easily allow us to respond to questions like an index, depending on the definition of an index. For example, if you want an index that has a short summary, That's not something that's available to us. We can give
On
something.
va parler des témoignages. Pouvez-vous m'expliquer?
Let's talk about the testimony. Can you tell me how it is that testimony in French was translated into English? It took some time. And testimony in English wasn't translated into French. There are people interpreting in the booth. Tomorrow morning, we will be receiving the blues. We'll be able to review your testimony, our questions. It will be available in both official languages. How is it that at the Rouleau Commission, the PCO, and this is not your first commission of inquiry, how is it possible that that same service wasn't available?
Service. So we provide them tools, we provide them advice. Ultimately, they decide how to run each individual meeting. I am not aware, but I'm not speaking definitively on this, that they translated any evidence from French to English, as I think I understood from your question. My understanding is evidence came in the language that it was submitted, and it remained in that language. I also do not know that the entire report was drafted in one language or the other. What I do know is that the final report was in both official languages. It's entirely possible there was a mix of the two in the document based on the evidence and how it was presented. But I would be speculating because I'm not part of the inner workings and was not.
Conseiller, le pauvre juge, là, il arrive, là, il est nommé.
But the poor judge, he was appointed, and he had to start from scratch. We saw the same thing with another commission. You're the one who's there to provide advice and support. You know how things work. How is it that there was no simultaneous translation and people producing the translations of testimony every day? Didn't you provide that as advice?
In terms of the use of official languages, we would absolutely, and are for the current commission, recommending that any public hearings have simultaneous interpretation as part of that. And so to your point, there was simultaneous interpretation as I understand it. I believe you're going a step further to say it should not only be translated, but there should be the equivalent of kind of the blues that come out from this committee. That is not a requirement of committees or of commissions, and it's not something they have chosen to do.
Pourquoi c'est pas une... C'en est une. C'est
But it is. It is a commission of inquiry. It's an institution created by an order that falls under the Official Languages Act. It was your responsibility to support the commission of inquiry, to make sure that documents was translated, that testimony was translated, that everything on the website was translated, which was not the case.
In terms of supporting the commission and all commissions, and I would echo what you said about I worked with Judge Rouleau, and he is a fantastic human being and was wonderful to work with. I would say there's a limit to what we can do in terms of support. We don't dictate how they run their commission. We provide support to help them implement what they would like to do.
Senator Carignan, your time is up. We'll move to Senator Harder.
Thank you very much. I would share the enthusiasm my colleague has for Justice Rouleau, only I mean it.
very impressive.
I just want to remind this committee that we've heard 63 witnesses over 2 years. We have all of their evidence in whatever language they gave it, plus the translation. We have all of their briefings, plus. What we're talking about here is what we as a committee asked for to be included in our deliberations was the Justice Rouleau's commission. And we then went further to say all the documentation associated with Justice Rouleau. We then went further and saying all of that documentation should be in both official languages. And if I'm correct, Mr. Shea, what I'm hearing from you is that Justice Rouleau's 2,000 pages, which are in both official languages, is consistent with the Official Languages Act and the practice of other commissions, and consistent with the practice of other commissions and the Official Languages Act. Other matters are in the language that they were provided. I'm a little worried that we're going down a rabbit hole in this committee trying to determine what else we need translated when we have a fair amount of evidence we've collected, all of Justice Rouleau's evidence, and we're now in our third year of deliberation. So my question, and I want you to confirm, Mr. Shea,
that Justice Rouleau conducted his commission in accordance with the Official Languages Act. Have you heard or been in receipt of any complaints from the Official Languages Commissioner
me.
with respect to?
I did.
I will ask him.
I mean, I did the plane. I did the
I
complaint.
know, but I'm going to ask him.
Oh,
Okay, he's the witness. Just an
I
idea.
received mine, I suppose.
And could you discuss how those complaints are being handled?
As your colleague mentioned, I do know we have received multiple complaints, and I was told in my briefing that one of them was from a member of the committee, and so I appreciate that disclosure. We receive those complaints and we answer them as best we can, appreciating the limitations of our knowledge of the interior workings of the Commission. We have responded to indicate that there was a translated report, as you mentioned. There was simultaneous interpretation, as you mentioned. I do not believe we have got a final ruling from the Official Language Commissioner as of yet, but we will certainly adhere to the recommendations that come from that. And I would say with every commission, we learn something. And if there is an opportunity that comes from an official language complaint that tells us a better way that we can conduct the business, we are absolutely open to adjusting the advice that we provide. We would similarly, though, if we had to do more translation, when creating them, ask for additional funding, because that would increase the cost going in. And so that is certainly part of the considerations in terms of how much required translation there is. They're absolutely funded to do everything that's required. If they wish to do more, they have that option, but they would have to ask for money to do that.
Finished. We'll move to Senator Smith.
I'm a newbie on this particular committee, and I've been listening to all of the testimony, and I guess I don't think it's a simple question, but, you know, I've written down some of the facts about what's transpired here, and I guess in my mind is, because I come from a business environment, is there appears to be an opportunity to get together and make some decisions as to what exactly needs to be translated if something is missing. But I would think that between both groups, you would have a flow chart, and you'd have the key issues on a flow chart showing from the start to the finish what needs to be done. And I'm just wondering, has that taken place? Because it's nice to have everybody giving testimony, but, you know, there's so much data that you've given to us, and it seems to be kind of flying up in the air. And I'm just wondering have there been discussions in terms of taking the proper steps to have a solution that's going to benefit the whole group of people who are interested in trying to get a solution, as opposed to going around in a circle? And I hate to be rude, but listening to it for the last period of time, it seems to be a bit of a revolving door. Let's get by who's guilty or who didn't do their job. Let's get on with getting the problem solved. I'm sorry to be so blunt, but I mean, God, I spent 30 years of my life running businesses, and I'd have probably some of you in front of me in a private office sort of asking these questions before we even got in here. Because we spent time, what have we accomplished?
I appreciate your question, Senator.
And I'm sorry to be blunt, but
Not at all. I appreciate the honest question. I think we have tried to provide a proposed path early on in the testimony. I think respecting the fact, maybe just to differentiate from the business, we are not necessarily here to be your advisors. We are here to answer questions, and ultimately you have a team that provides you advice. If you were asking me my proposed approach forward, it would be for us to provide you with the index and file names, as I mentioned. I think there's a decision point that needs to be made at that point. Does that need to be translated, or are the generic names of emails enough for the clerk of the committee or others to start to go through it? So I think that's a first point. And then the next piece would be, based on that, translated or not, if you were to highlight either here are the types of emails we would like, or, for example, we can say where evidence originated from. You're most interested in information, for example, from a certain province or from a certain organization. If you help us narrow it, we could then say, we've went from 152,000 documents to 5,000 documents, let's say. And then we could work with our partners to work on expediting that translation, our reviews, and that sort of thing. So very much that is what I would like to do and what I am trying to propose in the most appropriate way possible, understanding that we are witnesses here and it is ultimately your decision what you will ask for. We very much want to find a solution because I don't think any of us think that the right solution is to spend years and years and not provide this in a timely manner. We want to provide you everything you need to do the work in a timely manner and in a translated fashion.
How is that going to happen now?
I would hope, I saw in the motion that invited us that there was some discussion of within 5 days a prioritization or a list of documents. We would like to work with whoever you ask us to work with. We're happy to work with the clerk of the committee directly to actually walk through this is what we have and make some determinations as to what would be appropriate in terms of how consensus will be reached by the committee behind the scenes in terms of what you would like from us, working through the clerk. We would be very pleased to dedicate our time to do that as fast as we can. Pardon?
Role of the Translation Bureau?
The role of the Translation Bureau would be to then translate whatever that, give us a quote, and I think we'd want to come back and make sure everyone open eyes knew, okay, this is what it is, this is what we think the translation would cost, and then I think ultimately if we are told that's what you want, we would try to start working on that.
It'd be an interesting partnership if you could work together. Everyone seems to be taking their spot, and good luck with it. Thank you, Madam Chair.
We'll now move to second round. Mr. Brock and Ms. Romanado have 4 minutes. Mr. Fortin, Mr. Green, Senator Harder, and Senator Carignan have 3. Start with Mr. Brock. 4 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the witnesses for your attendance. I have a brief observation, one question, and then I'm going to cede my time to Senator Carignan. My observation is to refresh my colleague Yasser Naqvi's commentary regarding that he's proud of a government that believes in bilingualism. Well, I think, quite frankly, all 338 parliamentarians believe in that. But to refresh his memory, thanks to Sir John A. Macdonald and Sir George Etienne Cartier, the British North American Act allowed bilingualism in Parliament. The Translation Bureau was the creation of R.B. Bennett's government, and simultaneous interpretation was introduced in Parliament by John Diefenbaker's government. And the right to simultaneous interpretation in Parliament was enshrined in the Official Languages Act by Brian Mulroney's government. So I'm very thankful for previous Conservative governments that really enshrined bilingualism in this country. That's my observation. My question to the PCO. 31,000 documents from Justin Trudeau's government were before the Rouleau Commission. How many of that 31,000 never saw the light of day?
I'm not sure what documents are on the website. I would have to see. I think we would have to agree on a definition of never saw the light of day. They were provided to the Commission of Inquiry, who reviewed them and had unprecedented access to cabinet confidences and top secret documents to do their work. And ultimately, they encapsulated their conclusions from reading those documents in that 2,000-page report that is on the website.
And the only glaring exception to that was the legal opinion that the Trudeau government relied upon to invoke the Emergencies Act. In fact, it was Justice Rouleau who essentially questioned former Attorney General David Lametti and essentially said, what am I supposed to do? Am I supposed to just take your word for it? And David Lametti's response was, yes, despite the fact that there was an order of this committee to release that very said document. So that being said, I'm going to pass my time over to Senator Carignan.
Senator Carignan, you have a minute and a half.
Verbaux du cabinet.
If I look, I'm wondering, what I see is that the documents in cabinet were given in English only to the Rouleau Commission, but usually the documents are in French and in English. So did Justin Trudeau change the practice, and are the documents now only in English? Are the meetings only in English?
Senator, perhaps you can clarify where you're seeing that the documents were provided in English only and not in both official languages.
C'est les documents qui ont été fournis.
It's the documents that were provided to the Rouleau Commission. They were provided in English only.
All cabinet documents are translated, so absolutely cabinet documents themselves would be translated in both official languages.
OK, donc ça serait facile de les avoir.
So it would be easy to obtain them in French. The MOU, the memorandum to cabinet, was provided only in English?
Which is required to be translated in both official languages. Individual memos can be sent up in French or English, and in my experience, there's a mix of the two, depending on the topic, depending on the originator.
Donc, pouvez-vous prendre l'engagement de nous envoyer les procès-verbaux?
Can you send us those documents in French, the ones that were sent to the Rouleau Commission? Can you provide those to us in French?
Sent in the language that it was available. So if it was a cabinet document that was translated, it would have been available in both official languages. If it was a memo that was created in English, it would be sent as an English document. If it was a memo that was created in French, it would be sent as a French document.
Up, we'll come back to you at the bottom of the list. Ms. Romado.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm very happy to be here tonight, and I'd like to thank our interpreters who are doing such extraordinary work tonight. I am also on the Procedures Committee of the House of Commons, and last year we did a study on the hybrid parliament and the impact on translation and interpretation, and the possibility of taking part in a virtual parliament. At the time, we heard very clearly that there was a lack of staff, a shortage for translators and for interpreters. So I'd like to ask you, Mr. Limburger, adding this kind of project, will it compromise our capacity to do the work that we are doing in the House and in the Senate over the next few months? We know that until the end of June, it's possible that there will be sittings in the House until midnight, that many committees will add sitting hours and meetings, and that we will find ourselves in silly season with all the reports that will have to be translated. So I'd like to know, do you have the capacity, and have you thought of that increased workload? Because I don't want all of the work on Parliament Hill to come to a halt. Thank you for the question, Madam Chair. And it's true that our capacity in Canada is under pressure. Today we talked about AI, and the Translation Bureau plays a key role in language services in Canada. We work with universities to recruit translators and to train interpreters as well. Matthew Ball's team works on that, in fact, and we work overnight to produce the blues. Now, we have gone from 40 million to 55 million words. I know there are a lot of figures, but we look at number of words and financial figures as well. The estimate that we provided, 10 months for 124,000 pages, was took into consideration the workload that we know is coming. So we look at all possibilities to increase our capacity. And the key message here is that over the last 4 or 5 years, yes, AI has been helping us, but the number of documents that have to be translated also increases. So finding new translators and interpreters is an issue. Other departments also have financial pressures and are looking for solutions. And so at the moment, we are at full capacity at the Translation Bureau. Thank you. And that doesn't even take into account injuries that have been experienced by our interpreters. I'd just like to say that I don't agree with getting our documents in a single official language. If we receive any documents, they should be provided in both official languages. Thank you.
Fortin, 3 minutes. Mr. Fortin.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Shea, on June 13th, 2023, our committee adopted a motion to request translation of all documents. Since we didn't get a response on June 26th, we sent a letter to Mr. Hannaford, to your office, reiterating our request and asking for an update on the translation calendar that I was on in September. And then on November 14th, that was 5 months after our motion asking for translation, you wrote to us to tell us, well, it's a lot of pages, it's going to be very expensive, and it's going to take a long time. Now, we said, look, if we can help you, tell us. And then you said, yes, you can help us. We want an index of documents. That was November 21st. We still don't have the index. You wrote to us on December 5th saying, well, to get you the index will take you a long time. Will take us rather a long time. So are you still intending to help us? Because if you look at how much time has passed, we've been asking for these translations for 9 months. And if I understand correctly, you haven't even begun the translation work. So are you really claiming that you're taking this seriously, translating documents into both official languages, applying the Official Languages Act? Are you getting directives from your bosses saying, forget about it, it's not important, we don't have time to translate these documents? Or is someone saying, well, look, I don't have time, I'm busy? What is the reason behind this lack of response? You haven't even started translation 9 months later. If you said to me, well, Mr. Fortin, we've started, but it's going to take us another year, that would be one thing. But you haven't even begun the work. You can't even give us any progress. Senator Carignan asked a question about the documents that were received during the commission. There's no one in this room who's ever seen anything of the kind. I'm a lawyer too by trade, and this is something that I've seen in many different circumstances. Often we discuss cases and we translate the documents. Commissioner Rouleau isn't an inexperienced person. Now, I don't understand how the situation came to be. How do you explain the fact that nothing has changed over 9 months?
Time is up. Maybe Mr. Shea, you can be very...
Ça fait 9 mois qu'on attend. Quand même qu'on lui donnerait une minute de plus.
It's okay, it's okay.
I can give him a few extra.
No, Madam Chair, if I could, in my round, look, rightfully so, these sections are comment and questions. That read as a comment, but I would allow them the opportunity to respond. There was certainly a lot placed and put to you in the last 3 minutes, and so I'll use my time to give you my 3 minutes to respond to his questions, because I think they're important questions and Canadians and Quebecers deserve to know.
Thank you.
Mr. Shea.
Thank you for your question and thank you for your time. I think there's two parts to the question. One is what the commission did, and one is what we have done in the past 9 months or whatever the period has been. I think in terms of what the commission done, I'm really not in a position that I can speak for what Justice Rouleau did. I cannot speak to the independent commission and how it structured itself and how it did its work. I can reiterate that it provided that 2,000-page report in both official languages and that there was public interpretation, but I appreciate that there are other questions, and I'm not in a position to answer what a commission did. In terms of us, I am deeply committed to finding a solution to this. This is not my first time coming to a parliamentary committee. I am often guided by, in government we have open and accountable government is a document that was created under a previous government. It's been, reiterated by the current government. And there's a passage in there, and it's talking about, confidential information and cabinet confidence, but I think the theme applies. And the theme is really that we should be working with committees to find solutions to provide answers and not simply say we can't provide information. And so my goal, certainly today, and I think in those letters, one of them is from Alex, who is with me, is in a conciliatory way in a goal of finding a solution. And so I don't know why there was a delay in that first letter. I apologize. I don't know the exact timing. Since I have been involved, we have sent 2 letters to try to explain this is what your request means. And so that first request that I mentioned, using the math that our colleagues mentioned earlier, 1 month for 16,000 documents, we're talking years and years and years to be able to provide the entire amount. And so we wanted to make sure the committee understood that and to offer other options. We offered to translate the evidence and said that would take $16 million in this period of time. And the one thing I would like to point out is we have not been sitting doing nothing. We have been working to go through a set of documents we had no idea what was in there to try to itemize them a little bit better. And that's why today I can offer to give you a list in very quick, very short order.
I do have an intervention. Sorry. I do. I'm going to take my parliamentary privilege to have an intervention on one point, because I want to think about, what is your scope of authority to accept a $16 million budgetary pressure on your department, given that we haven't come to SUPs, there's no additional money. How are you authorized to do that? Could you have been authorized to undertake that work absent of some other type of intervention from government?
That is a very good point, and one that was part of the reason we wanted to put the dollar value in there. There is no question that PCO would not have the ability to spend $16 million on translation without funding from Parliament, approved by Parliament. And so there's no question, whatever this committee was to ask for, if it was a large number like that, we would need to put in a funding request to the Department of Finance, and we would need to come to Parliament to seek that funding. We simply don't have the ability to spend that kind of money within a department our size. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Mr. Green. I move to Senator Harder, to be followed by Senator Carignan. Senator Harder.
Thanks very much.
3 minutes.
I'd like to just follow up on the last train of thought. What is the de minimis funding, incremental funding, that could be proceeded with without having to go to Parliament for an additional fund? In other words, in your time frames that you're suggesting, you're assuming funding available. What I'm asking is, what are the roadblocks to getting that funding, and how much time are you adding for that?
Thank you for that. I think that would depend on the total amount. I mean, if we were talking $16 million, I think my
Is that $3 million?
I think we could find a couple $1 million. I think $2 or $3 million we'd be able to find, especially where we are in the fiscal year. If that was split over 2 fiscal years, as an example, $1.5 million each year, we could certainly try to find that.
And my second, changing entirely for my time remaining, I'd like to go back to your experience with previous commissions. This is unusual, you say. Can you describe whether there have been official languages complaints with previous commissions and how they were resolved, or whether there was access to either official language requirements that were added on after the commission tabled their reports? How extraordinary is this in your experience?
To the best of my recollection, I cannot remember any commission that I've been part of that has had a request like this. Certainly, I can say definitively for translation, this has never happened, that we've been asked for something that would cost tens of millions of dollars to translate. I do believe for missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, we did need to update the website after the fact. I believe we added additional translations of Indigenous languages, and so I know that there is some precedent for that. But I do not recall anything that would be on the magnitude of what we're discussing here today.
Just summarize where we're at. If we responded to your helpful suggestion and identified documents which this committee, in its collective wisdom, would desire to have, if that list were modest in the sense of a couple $1 million, it could be done quickly, and we would be in receipt of that material within weeks.
It is the translation piece that I don't want to speak for my colleagues. We could certainly produce the list in a matter of weeks. The translation piece, I think we would have to kind of look at a little bit. It's 152,000 documents with, a short title and a little bit of information, but that would still take some time.
Thank you.
Senator Carignan.
Je reviens sur la...
I'd like to come back to the question posed by my colleague, Mr. Fortin. On June 13th, 2023, this committee adopted a motion to suspend work until the documents were translated, and we sent the motion to you to request translation. On June 14th, what were you doing?
Exactly when I became aware of the request. I was not part of this committee work originally. I do know that in the early fall, there was a letter that was being drafted and sent to this committee responding to that request. I don't want to speculate. I don't know if that's related to Parliament adjourning and kind of timing. But absolutely, the internal discussions at PCO were, we would like to find a solution, and we would like to adhere to that idea of open and accountable government where we work with committees to find solutions. And so certainly that letter and the subsequent letter, the intention behind them was to very honestly disclose this is the work it would involve and open the door for discussions with the committee and the committee clerk to find a solution.
Mais vous avez rien fait de l'été, là, parce qu'il a fallu...
But we had to ask you again in October. We were all here saying, what is PCO doing? Are we going to get the translation? And we're the ones who asked once again, and then we got a response. So nothing happened over the summer.
So I can't speak to what happened over the summer. I can speak to in the fall, the recollection I have being involved was that we drafted a letter, we sent it to the committee. The committee, I believe, responded, and we responded a second time to try to articulate the cost of various options. We opened the door for translating just the evidence piece, as we understood that was an important piece, and it's been raised at this table today. And that's where the $16 million figure came from. But at the same time, we wanted to make clear that larger ask was over $300 million and many years to signal to the committee that certainly we would have a funding request that would go with that. And that was something that's more than PCO's entire annual budget.
Vous avez vu que le site web, la documentation...
You saw that the documentation on the website wasn't translated.
I will confess I don't spend a lot of time on the website. I think we would have known going in when it was handed over to us that they uploaded the evidence as the language that it was received in. My understanding is that is in keeping with the Evidence Act, and that there's actually concerns around if you do translation, it may actually change the meaning of evidence, and that is why it's done that way, as it's been explained to me by legal experts.
Il y a quand même 56 documents que c'est des représentants.
But 56 documents were presented and not translated, and nobody reacted to that?
I cannot speak to whether we had official languages complaints related to that specific, so I won't say nobody reacted to it. But that was, as I understand it, in keeping with the Evidence Act and not offside with the Official Languages Act as it's been explained to me. As mentioned before, we will see what the official language commissioner comes back, if one of the complaints relates to that, and if the official language commissioner
Donc, il n'y a
comes with
personne à PCO puis à la
So nobody at PCO or the Rouleau Commission was concerned at all about both official languages.
We were absolutely concerned with both official languages. I remember the work that went into the Commission of Inquiry's final report. You may recall that the commission has a timeline. Unlike most commissions where there's an ability to extend the work, there was a very firm timeline. And I can remember that there were nights and weekends worked with the help of our colleagues at the Translation Bureau to I would say it was incredible amount of work to get this translated, because we took just how serious it was to have this translated.
Colleagues, have a tight timeline. May I suggest that we go in this order? Mr. Motts, Mr. Maloney for 3 minutes, Mr. Fortin and Mr. Green for 2 minutes, and then we take our break. Otherwise, we're going to run into the next panel. Does that work? Okay, Mr. Motts, 3 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Mr. Shea, I understand Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister, is the minister responsible for PCO. Is that correct?
That is correct.
So has he been briefed on this issue?
I cannot speak to whether he's been briefed on this specific issue. He has a parliamentary affairs team that would be briefed, but I think it would be more likely the government House leader who would be briefed on these types of issues.
And so then are you aware if there's any direction to PCO then from either the minister, the Prime Minister, the House Leader's office on respecting bilingualism or ignoring it?
I can say with confidence that the direction we receive from all ministers is to respect official languages, to ensure bilingualism, to ensure interpretation in cabinet meetings, to ensure documents are available in both official languages. That is absolutely a requirement for everything we do.
So just, I wanted to just clarify something that you said earlier. You mentioned a comment about the, we know the Official Languages Act in 15, I think it's 15, or Section 2, a witness can appear in the language of their choice, and the hearing of witnesses in the official language of their choice, and they should be disadvantaged. You made a comment about the Evidence Canada Evidence Act, or under the Evidence Act, and you weren't sure that the evidence only need to be unilingual. Did I misunderstand you, or can you clarify your understanding of the provision of providing of evidence to a commission in this case? Whether or not it was only required to be unilingual, or does it have to be bilingual?
My understanding of the Canada Evidence Act, as it's been explained to me, and I will preface every answer with I am not a lawyer, and do not wish to entertain a legal debate with a number of lawyers in the room. My understanding is that the Canada Evidence Act says that you have to post it, or you should post it in the language it was submitted in, and my understanding is part of the rationale behind that is because the translation could be seen as altering the evidence.
So you're saying posted. So that's an interesting comment. It's not a matter of just having the evidence presented to the commission. You're talking the actual posting of that on the website or in a document? Is that it?
I'm saying my understanding is that when it's posted on a website, and just received, it needs to be kept in the language that it is received in, that it's not translated.
Okay, again, so what would be considered evidence under the Canada Evidence Act is a pretty broad term. So I'm just, thank you. I wasn't aware of that. I was just trying to get some
and I would add, if I could, witnesses were given the option to appear in the language of their choice as well. And so some witnesses appeared in English, some appeared in French.
Yep.
Mr. Maloney.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to all our witnesses for attending, for your patience and understanding. Mr. Shea, I don't know that anything here would qualify as technically a legal argument, so I don't think you missed out on anything. Just my observation. It seems to me we're going around in circles a little bit here. What we're trying to get to is if there is a smaller group of documents that we can obtain in a relatively short period of time at a relatively reasonable cost that are going to be relevant to our considerations here at this committee, and we can't seem to land on that. If I understand you correctly, this $16 million that you're referring to, you used a period of 10 months, I think, a couple of times tonight. In the letter that I've seen, it refers to a period of 12 months. In any event, it's going to be something just shy of a year. That is the smaller group of documents from which we would then be able to determine what documents we want. Is that an accurate summary? No?
No, and perhaps it's because I've not explained it well. The $16 million is for the exhibits that are on the website that we've been talking about that are currently in one language and not in both. That is the cost to translate those. The cost to translate a list we've not come up with, but it would be certainly less than that. It would certainly be something we could do more quickly because we're talking about one line per document as opposed to translating entire documents. So we could certainly come back very quickly and kind of quantify what that would look like for the committee. As a starting point, we think we could do that relatively fast.
And that's a list of documents without translating the actual documents themselves, correct?
Yes, that would be, whatever title they have saved it as. And so what we're seeing, and my colleague Alexandra has been looking through them, we see, email to so-and-so or document about X. So they tend to have enough information that I think you can get a sense of what they are. In addition, we can give a listing or a sorting by this is who. So we talk about how 88,000 of that 152,000 are productions from parties. We can sort them by party, and if you have an interest in certain respondents over others, we can prioritize those.
Okay, then we can pick and choose which evidence
that is our goal,
choose.
is to give you a menu of options and allow you to pick. We are interested in this particular person that.
Can
that
you give me a
documents.
ballpark how long that list might be?
For us, we can do it in a matter of a couple weeks, we think. I think the Translation Bureau, I'm loath to give an estimate on their behalf, but we're talking 152,000 times, 10 or 15 words. I don't know if they want to dare.
So it's a list of 152,000 items.
Exactly.
And so then we go through that list with a relatively short just description of what the document might be, and then we have to decide which of those documents we might want to look at. In order to look at those documents, you're then going to have to translate them and give them back to us.
Correct.
Okay. And in order to get those documents translated, you're going to have to request funding from somebody if it's more than a moderate sum of money.
I think the list we could probably do within
after the list. I'm talking about the next stage.
And I'd add, if I could, I mentioned at the start 4 large kind of groupings. One of the groupings is these internal administrative documents. That's 11,000 documents. If the committee was to say, we're confident we don't care about the HR and the finance and the internal documents, well, we can take 11,000 off the table right off the bat and focus on the rest.
Okay, thank you.
All your time's up. Mr. Fortin, 2 minutes. Mr. Green, followed by Mr. Green for 2 minutes.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll be quick. Mr. Shea, I'm very happy to hear your suggestion of making up this list of documents, but I still have a question. Our motion on November 23rd requested an index with the title of documents, the number of pages. We were requesting that back in November, and now it's February 27th, and you still haven't gotten around to it. Mr. Smith was right. I don't want to just voice my dissatisfaction. I want actual actions. So you talk about a couple of weeks, but what is that, 2 weeks, 3 weeks? Can you give us a specific timeline?
I can't speak to the translation piece, but for the PCO piece, I think 2 to 3 weeks easily we could provide this, and we can provide it as it's available. So some of it, the government pieces, we can do very quickly.
J'ai juste 2 minutes, je m'excuse, monsieur.
I'm sorry, I only have 2 minutes. Mr. Limburner, apologies. How long do you think it would take to translate those documents? Thank you, Madam Chair. I think it also clarifies the term index. If it's 152,000 lines, then obviously we could translate that a lot more quickly than the 124,000 pages. From what I understand, based on what Mr. Shea has said, the texts are quite short, but people with legal training would have to review them. to make sure it's clear. So I think we could potentially do that work within a few weeks. I'm looking at you, Annie. Yes, thank you for the question. A colleague calculated this 152 lines, so 2.2 million words. We would have to look into how we could get that translated, but it could be done. So are you saying 1 week, 1 month, 2 months? I would say 2 to 3 months. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Part of our work is to try to come out with some sound recommendations, and then if hopefully foreseeable future, we'll be doing that in a draft report with recommendations back to the House almost 2 years later. And I'm wondering if through your experience in this, if you might agree with a recommendation that there be clarity around future interparliamentary or joint committees that that the legislation of the Official Languages Act be the guidelines for which we define our requests for information. I'm wondering if you would agree with that, given just the volume and complexity that we've kind of walked ourselves into.
I don't think it would be appropriate for us to weigh in on your deliberations and your recommendations, but we would welcome whatever recommendations you have. I would reiterate, we would like to work with committees, and I think the goal we should have as a government is to work with your clerk and work with your members to find solutions before they take months and months. And so I appreciate the frustration, and I would like us to learn from this and be able to respond more quickly to future demands.
Thank you, Mr. Limburger. I'm going to ask you a question. You guys on a good day are pretty stretched. Is that fair to say, given the fact that you got a bunch of freelance work as a Labor Party guy and a union supporter myself? I'm not a huge fan of opting out. I'm not a huge fan of AI. In a perfect world, what would your complement look like of full-time equivalent kind of collective agreement protected people within your department to adequately deliver a bilingual government?
So as I mentioned, Madame la Présidente, so as I mentioned, the number of translators we have at the Bureau, they're at 700. 100 of those are supporting specifically the work of the Parliament, and we augment our work when the type of work is possible. So, for example, if it's a not classified document, then we can leverage some other type of translation services that are not as critique, if you want, than the one that we do have. But as I mentioned, the number of translators is something that we are tracking extremely carefully, because we hire pretty much everyone who's coming out of university in that domain, and we definitely have the capacity of the Bureau at heart for that. And yes, we're fully prescribed. Also, somebody mentioned about the interpreters and their health. That's another area. That's when we lose an interpreter, that's a critical services. We have to reschedule. Some events happen on a regular basis. If I can just add something, Madame la Présidente, is that not only we mentioned 2-3 months for the index, but as I mentioned earlier, we can release as soon as we get some. So early release of those that are translated as they are being done, that would bring them to you faster. Merci.
Mr. Limburger, let me, on behalf of the committee, sincerely thank our witnesses. Your participation is greatly appreciated, and the information you provided with as extremely helpful for our deliberations. I shall suspend this meeting briefly while our next panel takes its place at the table. Colleagues, we will resume. I shall now introduce our second panel. We will hear from the witnesses and then in turn to questions from members of the committee. Appearing this evening before the Joint Committee, please welcome the Honourable Dominic LeBlanc, PC MP, Minister of Public Safety, Democratic Institutions and Intergovernmental Affairs. The Honourable Arif Virani, PC MP, Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada. The ministers are accompanied by officials from the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, Mr. David Vigneault, Director, no stranger to this committee. And from the Department of Justice, Shailene Curtis Micallef, Deputy Minister and Deputy Attorney General of Canada. Samantha Maislin-Dixon, Assistant Deputy Minister, Public Safety, Defence and Immigration Portfolio. And Jeanette Etel, Senior Counsel, Human Rights Law Section. From the Department of Public Safety, Emergency Preparedness, Sean Tupper, Deputy Minister, and from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, Michael Deham, Commissioner. I remind the ministers that you will each be given 5 minutes for your opening remarks. Minister Virani knows this well. Mr. Virani, you may begin, followed by Mr. LeBlanc. Welcome back.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and it is a pleasure to be back. I remember these sittings quite fondly in terms of the timing. I remember being tired and hungry on most evenings, but it is a pleasure to see some very familiar faces and to see some new ones as well. So thank you very much for having me in this new capacity. So I'm here to discuss the declaration of the public order emergency, which took place obviously 2 years ago. I'm pleased to be back here at this committee. Since our government declared the public order emergency in February of 2022, there's been significant time, obviously, for review and for reflection on what was a very exceptional decision. The Public Order Emergency Commission, led by Commissioner Rouleau, was convened as one of the many accountability mechanisms inherent in the Emergencies Act in terms of the way the statute is structured. It found at that commission that the declaration of the public order emergency met the legal threshold in the Emergencies Act, and that it was appropriate and that its measures were effective. Obviously, this committee is also a statutory mechanism which ended up reviewing the operations of the declaration, and I was very privileged to be part of that work and that review. And I look forward to you concluding your work and seeing the final recommendations, which I believe were in draft format last time I was sitting at a table over where Ms. Romanado is sitting right now. Je tiens à rappeler au comité que la décision d'invoquer la loi.
I'd like to remind the committee that the decision to invoke the Emergency Measures Act was not taken lightly and required consultation with leaders across the country, including all provinces and territories. The measures we took were temporary and narrowly tailored to the emergency situation based on the information available at that time. All these temporary measures came to an end when the declaration of emergency was revoked on February 23rd.
The Act was a reasonable response to the extraordinary context of February 2022. I think time is fading in some of our memories of what the situation was approximately 2 years ago, including the very dynamic and the continuously unfolding situation in several parts of the country. As we stated in the explanation of the reasons for the declaration of emergency, there was a risk of serious violence that was a crucial consideration supporting the decision to declare a public order emergency. The sole purpose of the temporary measures that were made was to bring about a swift, orderly, and peaceful end to the circumstances that necessitated the declaration of the public order emergency. As required by the legislation, the Emergencies Act, the measures were consistent with the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and former Minister Lemaitre provided this committee with a charter statement outlining the charter considerations that were engaged. We recognize that the declaration of a public order emergency temporarily allowed the granting of extraordinary powers. However, the legislation balances this with a range of accountability mechanisms. Nous reconnaissons que l'invocation de la loi sur les mesures.
We recognize that invoking the Emergencies Act temporarily conferred extraordinary powers, but this had to be put into balance with a mechanism of accountability. One of its most important mechanisms is that when the act is invoked, the government is required to hold an inquiry at the end of the emergency. Commissions of inquiry are independent bodies charged with investigating a matter of public importance. They perform two important functions. They draw conclusions of fact and they make recommendations for the future. When unexpected, disruptive, or otherwise significant events occur that affect the lives of Canadians, the public has a right to know what happened, why it happened, and to learn from these experiences.
As you are all well aware, at this committee, our government was found to have acted reasonably and consistent with the law by Commissioner Rouleau in his report of the public inquiry into the 2022 public order emergency. That report by Commissioner Rouleau was released in February of last year, 2023. While I cannot comment on ongoing litigation, I can say that our continued position is that the government's actions were reasonable and justified based on what we knew at the time of the invocation. Les occupations et les barrages constituent une menace.
The occupations and blockades pose an exceptional and unprecedented threat to our economy and across our country. I am proud that we were able to use the legal tools at our disposal to find a peaceful resolution to a national emergency that threatened the very democratic values that contribute to the freedom of all Canadians.
Madam Chair, merci beaucoup.
Minister, and we'll turn to Minister LeBlanc.
Thank you, Madam Chair, honorable senators and colleagues in the House of Commons. Thank you for inviting me here. Unlike my colleague Arif, this is my first time at your joint committee. It's a privilege to be here. And Madam Chair, thank you for introducing the senior officials from the public safety portfolio who are accompanying me here this evening. I appreciate the invitation. The invitation was obviously following the federal court's ruling on the invocation of the Emergencies Act in 2022. I'm happy to be here with my colleague, the Minister of Justice and Attorney General, who indicated obviously the government's position with respect to ongoing litigation matters. Ceci étant dit, je souhaite aujourd'hui
Having said that, I would like to take this opportunity to discuss with the honorable members of the committee the exceptional circumstances which led the government to invoke the Emergencies Act in February 2022. These circumstances included unlawful countrywide protests that presented a threat to the safety of Canadians as well as disruptions to critical infrastructure.
Confronted with illegal blockades at border crossings and vital trade corridors. This impacted our economy, industry, and the jobs and livelihoods of many hardworking Canadians. Indeed, the blockade of the Ambassador Bridge alone affected about $390 million in trade every day. This bridge supports 30% of all trade by road between Canada and its most important trading partner, the United States of America. And I remember during those days multiple conversations I had with the Premier of Ontario, Premier Ford, about the importance of working with his government and using every available tool to bring this to a peaceful conclusion as quickly as possible. Coupled with the blockades, the illegal occupation of our city streets also presented very real threats to Canadian businesses, both big and small. Participants in these activities used a number of tactics to threaten and intimidate local residents and businesses. Their activities disrupted the peace and contributed to a general sense of public insecurity. Prior to the invocation of the Emergencies Act, citizens, municipalities, and the province of Ontario all participated in court proceedings seeking injunctive relief to help manage these threats, and a class action lawsuit was filed on behalf of residents of Ottawa. Chers membres du comité,
Honorable colleagues, given these exceptional circumstances, the government maintains, as my colleague indicated, its position that this unprecedented situation constituted a public order emergency. The government therefore also maintains that its use of the Emergencies Act was both necessary and lawful. And as you know, having studied the issue for some time, the decision was supported by the Commission, as my colleague indicated in its final report. After reviewing more than 85,000 documents, interviewing 139 individuals, receiving testimony from 76 witnesses, and hearing from 50 experts, the Commission concluded that the very high threshold required for the invocation of the Act was met.
The Emergency Commission found that the high threshold to invoke the Act was met. The Commission's report also provided recommendations that the government is carefully considering, and I hope to have, as early as next week, some details in terms of the government's specific response to the thoughtful recommendations of the Rouleau Commission. In particular, we're obviously examining recommendations to improve collaborations between jurisdictions, support community safety, help strengthen our capacity to respond to similar events of national significance in the future. So with that, Madam Chair, I'm obviously very happy with my colleague to answer any questions that committee members might have.
Both very much. We will move to our first round. First round will be 5 minutes, and we'll start off with Mr. Brock. 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Good evening, ministers and supporting cast. Thank you for your attendance tonight. It's been a long time coming to get both of you here and your supporting entourage, and we're very grateful. So I want to start off by just opining that it's of no surprise to me, and I'm sure many members on this committee, that both ministers doubled down literally on the same talking points that we've heard from this Liberal government throughout the last 2.5 years, but most importantly after the ruling of Justice Mosley. In my respectful opinion, the federal court ruling provided a massive political humiliation for the Justin Trudeau government. So to you, Minister Virani, were you given a copy of Justice Mosley's decision before it was publicly released at 1:03 p.m.?
I received Justice Mosley's decision when it was a matter of public record.
Thank you. So literally 14 minutes later, Minister Virani, at 1:17, both you and Deputy Prime Minister Freeland issued a release indicating that both of you were planning on appealing. Prior to you making that announcement publicly to Canadians, did you read all 191 pages of Justice Mosley's decision in the span of 14 minutes? Yes or no?
I was assisted by people who were with me, and we jointly reviewed the decision.
And did those people jointly review all 191 pages in 14 minutes?
We made an assessment of the decision, and you've seen the notice of appeal that is a matter of public record. We have tremendous respect for the federal court and for all of the judges therein. Reasonable people can have disagreements about matters of law and mixed matters of law and fact.
Thank you. How long does it take the Justice Department, how long does it normally take the Justice Department to publicly state whether they are going to appeal a court judgment?
I'm not aware of any sort of average in that regard, Mr. Brock. What I would say to you is that it's entirely context-specific. It's case-by-case determination.
In my 2.5 years as a parliamentarian, Justice Virani, I have witnessed your government opining on several Supreme Court of Canada rulings and various provincial Court of Appeal rulings, and the talking point has always been we need to review the decision, we need to measure a response, and we will decide in due course whether or not we will launch an appeal. But in this particular case, you clearly didn't read all 191 pages, but it was important to you because you were politically humiliated. The entire government was humiliated, particularly your Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, that you illegally invoked the Emergencies Act. That's why you received your marching orders, probably from the Prime Minister, if not from the PMO, to publicly state your intentions to appeal. Yes or no?
You're mischaracterizing exactly what I just said to you in my previous response. I said I was ably assisted by others who were there in the room, and we jointly reviewed the decision.
Minister Varani, you were a member of this very committee when on May the 30th, 2022, we ordered the production of the government's legal opinion. That motion passed unanimously. You were in support of that, Minister Varani. Now that you're in a position to do something about it, will you turn over the legal opinion?
The opinions and advice are matters of privilege, which you'll appreciate as a fellow counsel, Mr. Brock. So those are, and I believe you've received a response both from the previous Deputy Minister, Mr. Daig, and also the current Deputy Minister who's sitting beside me to that effect.
I don't appreciate that, Minister Varani. What is the government hiding?
Mr. Brock, we can discuss the importance of solicitor-client privilege, but I'll put it in a pithy manner. It is an important principle that has existed for literally centuries in our joint profession that you and I both...
There's precedent. If I interrupt, this is my time. If I can interrupt.
Madam Chair, can I finish my response?
Precedent. Minister Varani, this is my time.
Point of order.
Excuse me. It's very difficult for the interpreters to interpret when you talk over top of each other. So, Mr. Brock, I'll set you back to 45 seconds. Can you just shorten your question so we can get an answer in?
Mr. Varani, there is ample precedent of numerous governments, including this particular government, to have waived legal opinion, to have waived solicitor-client privilege. If the Prime Minister, to Justice Rouleau, was so serene and confident in his decision to invoke the Emergencies Act in light of Justice Mosley's repudiation of the invocation of that act, what is the government hiding?
Briefly, please, Mr. Brown.
I would say solicitor-client privilege is foundational to the development of legal advice in a candid and frank manner between a solicitor and their client. It is a sacrosanct privilege that has existed for centuries in British common law, and it is one that this government firmly believes in terms of producing.
And you, sir, have the position
advice.
to waive that privilege.
We'll now move to Mr. Maloney. 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate that opportunity. And ministers, other witnesses, I really want to say how grateful I am for you being here today, especially it's an evening meeting. My question, I guess, is for both ministers, but perhaps Minister Varani, it would make sense to start with you, given your background in this committee. Look, I've only recently joined this committee. In fact, this is my third meeting. You said you look back fondly on this. I look forward to the day that I can look back fondly on this committee. But unfortunately, as we've just witnessed, this committee has become highly politicized, and it's lost its way, frankly. If you look at the Emergencies Act legislation, there's two things. There's this committee and there's the Royal Commission. Both of them are put in place for very specific purposes. One is to look at the conditions that were in place that it required the government to invoke the legislation, and one, which is this committee, is to look at what goes on during the time when the committee or the legislation had been invoked, or the Emergencies Act had been invoked. We're about 2 days away from 2 years, two days away from the 2-year anniversary when it was invoked, and a few days away from 2 years to the anniversary when it was revoked. Now, I would say that this committee has gone far beyond its scope and far beyond its mandate, and I would like to hear your view on that, and perhaps Minister LeBlanc, too.
Thank you, Mr. Maloney, for the question. I'll say to you, my interpretation of the statute as it's plainly written was exactly the same when we first commenced at this committee, and many people who are members of this committee made the exact same argument that this was meant to be an oversight during the period of the invocation of a declaration. I think at this point we are where we are, but what I would say to you is that there still is, it's unfortunate and somewhat ironic that something that was commenced after the constitution of this committee, the Rouleau Commission, has concluded before this committee has even wrapped up its work. But I think there is still ample room for this committee to do the important work that a joint Senate House multi-partisan committee can do, which is actually provide recommendations. And providing those on a timely basis, as in very, very soon, would be helpful to the deliberations of all parliamentarians in terms of reflecting on the invocation and reflecting on the way forward.
Okay, maybe, look, I mean, you just had a discussion with Mr. Brock about the production of the opinion that was provided with respect to the invocation of the Act. Leaving aside the issue of solicitor-client privilege, I think that discussion is a glaring example of how this committee has gone beyond its mandate, because given the terms of reference for this committee, that opinion has no relevance here whatsoever. So my next question really is in terms of Minister LeBlanc had suggested he's going to have some response to Justice Rouleau. The two of you, particularly you, Minister LeBlanc, are going to put forward some proposals on how the legislation can be improved. Unfortunately, we might be in a situation where you don't have a report from this committee. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about how the legislation could be reviewed now, and would one of those proposals include redefining the scope of this committee in terms of a time frame so we don't run into this situation where we go beyond its scope, beyond the time, and turn the committee into something it was never meant to be?
Madam Chair, thank you, Mr. Maloney, for the question. My understanding of the statute, what I was briefed following the invocation and then rescinding the invocation, I thought my understanding of the role of this committee was as you described and as my colleague Arif, I think, also endorsed. Next week, I will set out the government's response to all of the Rouleau Commission recommendations. You properly noted, Mr. Maloney, that he does, in the Commission report, make suggestions around potential legislative amendments, some around the Emergencies Act, the definition of in the CSIS Act. Those are complicated undertakings, and I think the government and Parliament would very much benefit from the advice of this committee, because it's a committee representing both houses of our Parliament. I think there's a unique opportunity to hear from parliamentary colleagues on how Parliament may consider those legislative amendments. I'll be setting out specific government responses to some of the more administrative, police of jurisdiction issues that the Commissioner identified. And as you would know, a number of the recommendations also touched other orders of government. But we will be, I hope, providing a detailed response, as we committed to do. But I totally share your view, if I understood it, Mr. Maloney, that it would be certainly helpful, I think, to Parliament to benefit from the view of a committee of parliamentarians that has studied this issue in terms of, are there legislative steps? The Emergencies Act, as we heard, is a piece of legislation that's almost 4 decades old. The first time it had been invoked, so it would be a thoughtful exercise, I think, that would benefit Parliament.
Time is up. Mr. Fortin.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First of all, welcome, everyone. Welcome to the ministers and to all our guests. A question for Minister Virani. You were saying earlier that we've been sitting for quite some time, and the Rouleau Commission has already given in its report. You were here in June 2023, and you'll remember that we voted for a motion requesting the translation of all documents before the Rouleau Commission. What would you say if I told you that today, 9 months later, we still haven't received any of those translated documents, and the PCO hasn't even started working on that translation project? I can't really speak to that. I remember when this was raised in June, and what about the delay, Mr. Minister? 9 months later, nothing has been done. Are you surprised by that? I have no information on the topic. I think you should ask the witnesses who appeared before us. Thank you. Minister Virani, you say that the decision to invoke the act was made based on the information we had. Now, Minister Leblanc, you were in cabinet when the act was invoked. Do you agree that it was based on the knowledge you had at that time? Absolutely. We discussed the issues broadly in different forums, and we came to a decision that we believed was reasonable and legal based on the information we had at that time. You know that at this committee, this all happened 2 years ago, and we were struck a year and a half ago. And the evidence that we heard, well, I didn't hear anything that seemed to justify the invocation of the act. The blockade at the bridge was dismantled before the invocation of the act, and then there were trucks downtown, of course, but the chief of police, Mr. Soli, came to speak to us to say that he had requested a certain number of police officers to dismantle the blockade here downtown, and it happened after he had left. Now, I don't really understand what the justification was. It seems to me that invoking the act was a little excessive. The only thing that I wonder is all ministers who've appeared here say, look, I understand, but we based our decision on a legal opinion that we were given. So do you agree with what your predecessors have said, that you cannot share that legal opinion with us? Are you able to justify the invocation of the act by letting us see the legal opinion? I rely on what my colleagues said when it comes to the legal opinion. Honestly, if you had been in cabinet during those discussions, personally, I was persuaded through our discussions with law enforcement. Sorry for interrupting. We don't have much time. The commissioner said that she had not recommended invoking the act. I don't want you to spend too long on that. No, I don't want to spend time on that. But what I wanted to say is the issue of whether there would be other events like what we saw in Coots in Alberta, what we saw at the Ambassador Bridge. We didn't have enough confidence in the fact that there wasn't a risk of more violent events occurring. We also were in communication with Ontario. Forgive me, we only have a few seconds. Are you saying that you invoked the act as a preventive measure in case other events occurred? I don't want to insult your intelligence, but I am sure you were convinced it was the right thing to do at the time. But I'm asking you to explain this to us, because that's our job here. Nobody is willing to explain it to us. Well, we explained it. Several senior officials and ministers explained it during the Rouleau Commission for hours at a time. It was televised live, and Justice Rouleau concluded that it was legal and justified. But can you send us the legal opinion?
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Mr. Green?
Thank you. Minister LeBlanc, you opined on the scope of this committee and our responsibilities and the timelines in which, we've taken on coming ultimately to hopefully some recommendations in the near future. And yet the Rouleau Commission accorded you 12 months to respond, and that deadline is passed. Why?
Because, and as I said, I will have detailed responses as is appropriate, of course, to the Commission's recommendations. We wanted to, in light of the federal court decision, we wanted to ensure that the government response would take into account the trial division decision. and we wanted to ensure that as we were responding to those recommendations, it would be done in a way that would be consistent with the government's decision also to go to the Federal Court of Appeal on that decision. So, but for that court decision, we would have done it last week or this week. Good news is I'll be happy to do it next week.
And in part of that report, will you provide an explanation for the changing nature of your definition of a threat to security of Canada, as is accorded under Section 2 of the CSIS Act?
And it's an issue that the Commission raised. It's an issue that I know has been discussed at this committee. And our response, as I said, will detail the government's specific response to all of the recommendations of the Rouleau Commission, including his suggestions around legislative change.
Mr. Vigneault, have you undertaken any work at CSIS to provide input or memorandums or any kind of background briefing documents to Cabinet relating to your organization's position as it relates to Section 2 of the CSIS Act in accordance with the parameters set out for a threat to national security?
Madam Chair, we have done work on Section 2. We have been doing work on a different aspect of the CSIS Act for years. And when the government comes up with its decision on the responding to the Rouleau Commission report, we will be able to advise the government and provide our analysis in due course.
Mr. LeBlanc, I would put to you that at this point, we still haven't heard, in my opinion, an adequate explanation from the government on its use of that definition under the Act. And now we're hearing in other bodies that they've expanded the use. They've perhaps provided some editorial expansion on the definition of a threat to national security. But I can share with you that despite all the meetings and all of the witnesses that we've had here, I've yet to hear anybody clearly articulate the government's rationale for changing that definition. Will that be included in the Rouleau Commission report, specifically that point? Your report back as
our response to the Rouleau Commission report, yes. Well, again, I know people will be very excited to see the government's response to the Rouleau Commission, and the good news is it's coming soon. And as I said, we think Justice Rouleau did an important, exhaustive
Mr. LeBlanc,
work.
Sir, please. We've been at this for quite some time. I'm asking you a direct question. I'm going to ask for you to provide a direct response.
So I'm not going to tell you what's in the government response to the Rouleau Commission. I'm telling you if
Okay, so, sir, what I'm going to put to you is that this committee has a responsibility. We've heard Mr. Varani and many people come before this committee talking about client solicitor privilege. We had that conversation today at Ethics. We heard him say it was sacrosanct. I would put to you that the powers of Parliament supersede that in our ability to send for documents and get information. So if it's your position that you're not willing to testify on a very basic answer tonight, are you then prepared to come back to this committee in 2 weeks? And are you then prepared to be a part of a process that prolongs this committee rather than just answering a very straightforward question, sir?
You've asked about 4 or 5 questions.
It's one question.
You say is a straightforward question.
It's one question. Let's not dance around it.
You said that I wasn't prepared to testify about that tonight. What I said is I wasn't prepared to talk about the government's detailed response to the Rouleau Commission report.
It's not what I asked.
Until we talk about it publicly next week.
What I asked was, will that be included? Will it be included? That specific parameter.
The government will respond to every one of Justice Rouleau's thoughtful recommendations.
Mr. Varani, is it your contention that cabinet confidence is supreme and superior to the Parliament's privileges here as accorded through long jurisprudence within the House of Commons?
I'm glad you raised cabinet confidence because I think it's important to understand, because you have raised this and Monsieur Fortin raised it, but the functioning of a parliament and our system of parliamentary democracy as it's been inherited from the Westminster model includes cabinet confidence. So we're not just talking about solicitor-client privilege materials, we're talking about cabinet confidence, which exists to promote open and candid discussions around the cabinet table in the public interest that will be fearlessly advanced at that table and then defended.
Mr. Varani, as you would have heard in my previous testimony, we've had these discussions, and you're a very learned lawyer, you're the Attorney General now, that despite that assertion outside and within the courts, inside Parliament, would you not agree that the Constitution states that Parliament has the power to send for people documented information that would supersede this notion of everything being client solicitor privilege?
Mr. Green, your time is
There's 10 seconds left, is there not? No?
Not according to mine.
Oh.
But I will, I am next, so Mr. Green, will you take the chair?
Happily.
And Mr. Vrani, I would ask you to take the opportunity to answer his question.
So I agree that Parliament has the power to make the request. I do not agree about it superseding necessarily cabinet confidence. Cabinet confidence is waived very rarely.
Thank you. I'd like to go back to Minister LeBlanc's report we may see next week around the recommendations, and you can either respond to this or perhaps the Commissioner can. What emphasis or what may we see around the role of layers of policing, particularly around this city where residents raise major concerns about the delivery of police services?
Senator, thank you for raising that, and maybe the Commissioner will want to add something. That was absolutely one of the takeaways of the Rouleau Commission, the confusion that existed in terms of who had jurisdictional responsibility on Wellington Street, the Parliamentary Protective Service. All of you know this probably better than I do. But when I read the Rouleau Commission report, his focus on the clarity as between the different polices of jurisdiction, the role of the RCMP, the Ottawa Police, the Ontario Police Services Act. It was a discussion that I remember having with Premier Ford. So we will have something very specific to say about that next week, and we hope that it will be, we think, a rather full answer to that challenge that Commissioner Rouleau identified, and we've worked on that for the last year, but maybe Commissioner Duhem wants to add something on that specific issue as well.
I can just add, Madam Chair, that since then we've seen a difference in requesting for resources, and I think there's a historical part here that needs to be understood as well. When the RCMP was responsible for the Hill, we worked jointly with Ottawa Police Service because most of the demos would start in the street and end on the Hill. And when PPS took over, the RCMP were no longer present. And that reflex of calling the RCMP and assistance was still there. And now I'm happy to say that the first call for assistance for additional resources goes to the OPP, for Ottawa Police Service, goes to the OPP. And if for some reason Commissioner Carrique cannot supply the resources, they'll come to the RCMP.
Thank you. And so would it be fair for me to assume that the police agencies, the heads of the agencies that were involved, Ottawa, the OPP, and the RCMP, have actually done a debrief of the situation? Because it appears to me, and you know I have some understanding of the issue, that despite the provincial concerns that were expressed, there did not seem to be much communication. I'm not talking between police services, I'm talking between governments on the actual decision-making throughout the event. So I think we heard evidence here, and we attempted to have representation from the province here. They were not. They refused to come. And so I'm curious as to if I'm an Ottawa resident, I'm sitting here next week, can I expect that the reply that will be given out next week will include and erase my concern about what we saw take place?
Are you talking from a law enforcement perspective? Because you mentioned also government not talking to each other.
Well, depends how far you think they're separated, but yes.
So from a law enforcement perspective,
yes.
We are in a different place that we were when Convoy happened, and we've seen it through different events that took place in Ottawa. From a government perspective, I'll let Minister LeBlanc respond to that.
Very, very careful dodging there, Mike. That was well done. But Senator, again, I think that one of the thoughtful findings of the Rouleau Commission, his phrase that was often repeated was a failure of federalism. Whether that was in the report or in comments that he made around the release of the report, we certainly took note of that and recognized that for those residents in Ottawa during those weeks, they would not have understood as between the municipal order of government, the province of Ontario, and the government of Canada, there wasn't a more direct way to sort out that exact contradiction or confusion that I think you properly identified in your question. I know that during those weeks, my colleagues, the then Public Safety Minister was talking to his Ontario counterpart, the Solicitor General, the Transport Ministers were speaking. I was talking to Premier Ford as the Intergovernmental Affairs Minister at the time. But we do think that there needs to be a more structured way in those exact circumstances to remove sort of the hesitation if it's one order of government or another. The citizens wanted that situation resolved peacefully and quickly, and it took way too long to do that. And I think next week we're going to have something to say about the structures that both the commissioner referred to, the law enforcement, obviously structures that he can speak to, but we recognize that it has to be sort of the whole of government needs to recognize its relationship with partners.
Senator Carignan, you have 5 minutes.
Oui. Ma question s'adresse aux deux.
My question is for both ministers. Do you have anything to hide?
Plaisir de vous voir, sénateur.
It's a pleasure to see you, Senator. No, I don't. Then why don't you provide us with a legal opinion? Can I answer, Madam Chair? Because it is subject to solicitor-client privilege. Okay, fine. I'm a lawyer. I remember. I spent a lot of time studying privilege, but who's it in favor of? The cabinet, the client, the client. So why doesn't cabinet simply revoke that confidentiality? I think you two probably have a lot of power in cabinet. What are you waiting for to provide us with a legal opinion? Mr. Minister, you say Justice Rouleau decided this, decided that. He studied everything, but he did not study the legal opinion. It was refused to him. So there are two things. Either it's legal or it's unlawful. Forgive me, but every time the senator hits the table, it can harm the interpreter's hearing. My apologies. What are you waiting for? If the legal opinion is lawful, then share it with us, and we'll clear it up immediately. Mr. Senator Carignan.
You would appreciate that it is not the contents that we're trying to protect. What is critical in protecting solicitor-client privilege is a relationship that existed, as I mentioned, for hundreds of years between solicitors and their clients, which promotes candor and free and full and fair advice. Understanding that privilege is sacrosanct between that professional and their client. It is important to the functioning of law in this country and in British common law.
Don't talk to me that way. I feel like you are taking me for a fool.
Madam Chair?
Please do, and then Senator
J'en ai
Carignan.
des clients.
So the point
Eu des clients. Si le client
I guess I'm not
me
able
dit,
to finish,
si
Madam
le
Chair.
client
Senator
me dit, vous pouvez parler,
Senator
donner l'opinion
Carignan.
juridique.
If a client tells me that they are breaking solicitor-client privilege, then it is broken.
I remember fondly your frequent references to Supreme Court case law at this committee, Monsieur Le Carignan. The Supreme Court in case law has actually attributed this, and I'm reading from a case called McClure, that this ensures vitality of full
I conclude
between those who need legal advice and those who are best able to provide it. The
Point of
resulting
order, Madam
confidential
Chair.
relationship between the solicitor and client is a necessary and essential condition of the effective administration of justice. That's the Cour suprême du Canada.
OK, donc vous la cachez.
I've got a point of order.
Madam Chair,
Those are your words, sir.
maybe it's a function of people talking over each other, but I know that the interpreters are having a very difficult time translating the exchange. And when they have difficulty, we lose out. Those who
Couldn't
don't
agree with you
understand the
more.
French language, I would have loved to have fully understood what Senator Carignan was putting to this witness, but I wasn't able to.
Okay, so
Translation was not able to keep up.
I totally agree. May I ask all committee members and the witnesses to refrain from speaking over each other, allow the witness to answer, and then ask the question. If you need it shortened, you can indicate that. So, Senator Carignan, you have 1.5 minutes left.
Donc, j'en conclus que vous avez quelque chose.
So I can only conclude that you have something to hide.
Have that on the record,
Pouvez-vous
Madam Speaker.
m'expliquer que
Can you say the emergency measures were essential? There's a note here, Jacqueline Bogdan, Vice Secretary, and they sent this to us after we requested this. Daily report, 11th of February, 8 a.m. A few people are on Wellington Street and surrounding streets. February 12th, 8 a.m., 0 to 5 people on Parliament Hill, a small number of people on Wellington and surrounding streets. February 14th, 8:13 a.m., nobody on the Hill, nobody on Wellington or neighboring streets. And then you invoke the Emergencies Act? Madam Chair, I remember Ms. Bogdan. She's a senior official at PCO. I haven't seen the document that Senator Carignan was citing. I was part of the incident response group. There were several officials describing a dynamic situation in several jurisdictions. I'm not sure how many people were on the street corner on Wellington at 8 a.m., but I'm very comfortable with the decision the government made.
Senator Harder.
Thank you very much, Chair. Colleagues, I think while we're 2 weeks after Groundhog Day, we're very much practicing the Groundhog Day theme by revisiting stuff that Mr. Virani, you participated in as a member and now as a minister. As a resident of Ottawa who was here during that whole episode, my question 2 years ago was, what took you so long? And my question today is, I'm on the appetite, Minister LeBlanc, of your announcement next week. Will that include commitments with respect to Wellington Street? Could you tell us whether or not there have been any consultations at the provincial level so that your statements of next week will reflect joint efforts, or is this a unilateral announcement?
So, Madam Chair, through you, thank you, Senator Harder, for the question. And I, too, was in Ottawa, not a resident of Ottawa, but I was in Ottawa during those weeks myself. And I certainly shared the sentiment that you expressed. And we all have friends and family members that witnessed that circumstance as well and came to the same conclusion. The response next week will be the Government of Canada's response, obviously, to the Rouleau Commission recommendations. Some of those recommendations were properly directed at other orders of government, as you noted. I don't purport to think that the Rouleau Commission will deal with the long-standing issue around Wellington Street, the jurisdiction of Wellington Street, the role of the City of Ottawa, the parliamentary precinct. I know that some of my cabinet colleagues, and maybe the Deputy Minister who's with me is in a better position, having participated in some of those conversations. That wouldn't be part of what we're going to be talking about next week, but I know that it's an active discussion, and I've heard, for example, my colleague Jean-Yves Duclos discuss that, but perhaps if Mr. Tupper has something around Wellington Street per se that I haven't contemplated in the Rouleau Commission finding, if you're okay, Madam Chair, perhaps the Deputy Minister could add something?
Simply to add that indeed conversations have been ongoing for some time. I would split them in two categories. The first is the definition of the Hill precinct and how it is defined and what boundaries are set to it. And the second is how is it policed and maintained. I've been involved in the second part of those discussions. They have been across jurisdictions, and we have been trying to develop advice that can be brought forward to make sure that we have the cleanliness of lines of reporting and the ability to respond faster in the future.
Very much. My subsequent question is to Mr. Vino. As I look at the witnesses, you're the only one that's been here before. Is there anything in your previous testimony that in hindsight, if I can quote Mr. Justice Mosley, hindsight is apparently important in judicial practice. Anything that you would wish to add or comment on?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Senator Arder, I do believe that what I personally have taken from the Commission of Inquiry, from Commissioner Rouleau, it's sobering in terms of something very important that took place in our country. As Director of CSIS, our job is to look at the threat that we're facing. And unfortunately, you know, this Commission of Inquiry, the work you're doing, and what we've been talking about is just demonstrating that, you know, the threat that we face in our country is getting more complex, is getting more pervasive. And so I welcome these discussions because I think, you know, we need to do more to be able to protect Canadians. So that will be my own takeaway, if I can put it this way.
Thank you very much. If I have time, my last question is for Minister Virani. I appreciate that you're reluctant to get into matters that are before the courts, shall I say. But I, for one, very much favor the action that you took in terms of appealing the ruling. Is it possible for you to give me a little bit of some of the legal questions that you feel are important to have the court review? I referenced, perhaps sarcastically, the evidence in hindsight. Is that one of the principles of administrative law that you would like clarity on?
Well, thank you, Senator Harder, for that question. What I can do is, it's given that the litigation is underway, is I can sort of direct you to the notice of appeal, which has been filed, which is a matter of public record, and there's issues of law in terms of the standard of review that was applied in this context and whether the standard was correctly articulated and correctly applied. There's issues that relate to evidence, and there's issues that relate to the constitutional findings of the federal court. But I would just reiterate that obviously while we have tremendous respect for all of the courts in this country, there are concerns with this particular decision, and based on that we are pursuing an avenue that is available in Canada, which is the appeal that we've filed.
I move to Senator Smith.
Question for Minister LeBlanc. Following up MP Green. In his decision, Justice Mosley noted that it was responsible for the government to be concerned about economic impacts of the blockades, and in a very broad sense, it could be considered, quote, threats to the security of Canada. Justice Mosley also notes that it's very hard to define what national security means. As MP asked, in what ways will this issue be fixed? How should we define what national security does mean?
So, Madam Chair, thank you, and thank you, Senator Smith, for the question. That is an issue that the government has reflected on since the invocation of the Emergencies Act and since, obviously, the Rouleau Commission findings. As I said, the government's intention was to respond publicly within a year, as we'd committed to doing, but the court decision that you quoted gave us a few weeks of extra work to reflect on that very issue. We had said at the time, and I remember my colleague, the finance minister, before the Rouleau Commission herself, saying that we thought that the economic security of Canadians was not the sole determining issue, but was part of a broad-based government conclusion that the security of Canadians was threatened and there was a state of public emergency that had been achieved, had been reached. Those were the discussions that the government was having at the time, and certainly when I spoke to Premier Ford, when I spoke to Atlantic premiers who were worried about pop-up demonstrations at other border crossings, the Premier of British Columbia had spoken to me in light of some reports that the Pacific Gateway crossing might be blocked. So you had other first ministers in another order of government across the country, from the Atlantic coast to British Columbia, with a lot of focus in the province of Ontario, telling us that they had, and their police forces were telling them, that there was a real risk of sort of a contagion of these economic blockades, and they were expressing very publicly and very privately to us the concern that the government needed to bring every possible instrument to bear to bring these situations to a peaceful conclusion.
And if I could ask one more question, the timing of the acceleration of the threat. How was that handled amongst the various players, not only from the federal government, but the provincial governments and the forces on the streets? How was that handled?
So, Madam Chair, perhaps I don't know if it's the commissioner or the director of CSIS perhaps can add, because they participated in some of those discussions. Certainly, Director Vigneault was in his job and was in some of those same meetings as I was at the time, or the Deputy Minister. I know that as a government, we looked at a threat picture across the country based on what we were hearing from law enforcement partners across the country. And as I said, there was, and this was publicly available reporting, an increased risk of sort of a contagion or a spread. That was one of the important factors we considered, but I don't know if the Commissioner or David wanted to add something.
Yeah, Madam Chair, very briefly, Senator Smith, the way that the system worked at that point is very quickly the different levels of law enforcement and intelligence got together through joint teams. We had a team here in Ottawa. There was a team in the province of Ontario as well that was stood up with the OPP. And the purpose was to share in a very dynamic way intelligence and information to understand. So from a CSIS point of view, my people at the table, their job would have been to bring in intelligence about the threat actors that we were concerned with and be able to get information from law enforcement to inform our own investigation. And so that very dynamic process was taking place at the officials levels, law enforcement and intelligence, in Ottawa, but also in the province of Ontario. And that information was then fed up to the incident response group that Minister LeBlanc referred to earlier, so that the cabinet represented by the members at the IRG would receive that information and that advice.
Western Canada, where you had a major dust up west, was that part? They were part of that?
Absolutely. So, for example, at this point, the RCMP, my RCMP colleagues and the Canadian Border Services Agency had people on the ground who would be reporting right away to Ottawa in terms of what was happening. And then, that information is analyzed and then, reported back up. And then, depending on the situation, CBSA or CMP, in some cases, CSIS, would take, specific operational measures to be able to address the situation at the same time as we're providing information and responding to advice requests from the government.
Colleagues, we have time to move to second round. We will have 4 minutes for Mr. Motz and Mr. Nakvi, and then 3 minutes for Mr. Fortin, Mr. Green, Senator Harder, and Senator Carignan. I believe that will bring us to a close, and so I'd ask Mr. Motz to begin for 4 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you, ministers and witnesses, for being here. I've been here as well all this time. I've studied as much information as I can at this committee and outside of this committee on the invocation. I still believe more strongly today than I did in 2022 that the circumstances to invoke the act were not met, the threshold was not met, and in fact agree with Justice Mosley on his decision that it was in fact illegal and unconstitutional. That is a binding precedent, unlike Rouleau's particular ruling. Now, the other thing that I think the Canadian public need to understand is Canadians expect their government to follow the law, the rule of law, and not create an interpretation thereof that is convenient for the government to circumvent the existing law. And, Mr. Virani, you had indicated that, there are hundreds of years of precedent for lawyer-client privilege. And, the relationship has lasted hundreds of years. And you know what else has lasted all that time? For Parliament to make laws of the land which govern the people. And by invoking the Emergencies Act, the Cabinet gave itself the power to pass criminal laws which Mosley found to be unconstitutional. Now, my question to you is, have you actually found and read the infamous broader interpretation? Yes or no? The government relied. Have you actually read the legal opinion, the broader interpretation that the government was telling everyone that they relied upon to invoke the Emergencies Act? Yes or no?
Mr. Motz, I'm trying to be helpful, but even answering that question would disclose social-client privilege, which I cannot do here. But what I would say to you is that
let me stop you for a minute. you obviously, can you answer me the date stamp that was on that?
Mr. Mott, so in terms of solicitor-client privilege,
okay, so you can't. The reason I asked that question,
the questions you're asking me,
yes or no, you've already answered. It was a yes or no.
Remember, excuse me?
Yeah.
Remember, we have interpretation. Please
it was a yes or no question.
Please don't talk over each other.
Mr. Varani, I don't believe for a second that the broader interpretation even existed when the Emergencies Act was invoked at the time of the invocation for a number of reasons. And, it wasn't really until just weeks before the Reload Commission was about to begin that we all of a sudden heard about this broader interpretation, that it somehow magically appeared. And it's really quite disturbing that this broader interpretation is there now, and no one's seen it. No one's heard it, apparently. Mosley didn't get an opportunity to have it as part of his disposal, and neither did Justice Rouleau, who indicated that the evidence that he found to support the government's invocation was weak at best, and that anybody else could have come to a completely different conclusion. He was disappointed the government withheld that. So one of the questions that I've had for a long time is, who actually is the client? And you're hiding behind solicitor-client privilege. And why is it so difficult to, is it the government? Is it of Canada? Is it the governor and council? Is it the prime minister? Is it the attorney general? In your opinion, who is the actual client in solicitor-client privilege in this particular case?
In this particular case, the client is the government of Canada, and what I would say to you is
the same thing I said.
The same thing I said to Senator Carignan, which is that there's nothing to hide, but there's everything to protect. And what my job is to protect basic principles about the administration of justice. Solicitor-client privilege is fundamental to that system, as the Supreme Court has opined.
Well, we're just getting wound up.
I know. Mr. Nakfi.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and I want to thank my colleagues, both ministers, to be here. In fact, this committee has gone this so long that we've got alumni now coming and visiting and presenting at the committee. So great to see the Attorney General here. Look, every time I'm in this committee, I get more and more frustrated. Somebody who represents downtown Ottawa by the collective, at times, amnesia of committee members in terms of how they've forgotten what members of my community in downtown Ottawa went through. Just let me remind you that convoy, that occupation of downtown core lasted for 1 month and 1 day. That is 31 days of downtown Ottawa completely blocked with trucks of all sizes, most of them running 24/7 with just bellowing diesel fumes in the air. Not to mention, as I may remind all of you, and quite a few of members stay in downtown, they honked all night long for almost 31 days until a court order had to be received. In that entire process, I think some of you may have forgotten that there was violence, there were hateful messaging and insignia to the point that there's always also a witness of a Nazi flag during that convoy. People of different backgrounds, especially racialized people, were harassed. There was an order of emergency that was declared by City of Ottawa, which failed to put an end to that protest. There was an order of emergency that was declared by the province of Ontario that failed to end that occupation until the federal government took action through the invocation of the Emergencies Act. To this day, the trauma in my community is real. Just a week and a half or so ago, the second anniversary, quote unquote, was celebrated, where protesters were in town. I heard from so many constituents of mine who thought about leaving their homes again because they were scared and concerned, because the trigger that caused to them. So while members has the convenience and the luxury of sitting around talking and debating solicitor-client privilege in this committee, I do want to remind all members what a community where people live, where businesses usually thrive, went through. And all and any action was necessary to put an end to that occupation, not to mention what was starting to happen across the country, whether it's the Coots border crossing or what happened in Windsor. So my question is this. I found, and I'll start with the Attorney General. I found it quite amusing that even Justice Mosley, in his ruling, stated that if he was making a decision at the moment when these things were happening, he would have invoked the Emergencies Act as well. Can the attorney comment on that particular sentiment, and how does that factor into the appeal that he has filed, among other issues? And I know he may not be able to go in too much detail, but I would like to hear the consideration that he took into account in the notice of appeal that he's filed.
Minister Vrani, you have about 10 seconds to answer.
I think matters of evidence and the evidence that was used to inform the decision and the timing of the decision are squarely at issue in the notice of appeal.
Thank you. We'll now move for 3 minutes for Mr. Fortin.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to come back to you, Mr. Leblanc. You're the only one who was in the room at the time now. I understand you're not going to show us the legal opinion. And we're always served the same argument to justify the invocation of the act, but I understand we're not going to see it. Now, one of you, I think it was you, alluded to consultation with the provinces. Do you remember the result of that consultation? The day the government went ahead with the invocation, we only have a few seconds. I don't want to be rude. Yes, but I was speaking informally with different premiers. Forgive me, let me rephrase. The law says you must consult the premiers of provinces. Absolutely, yes. I was part of that discussion with Mr. Trudeau. So, do you remember the result of that consultation with the different provinces? Yes. Is it true that only 3 provinces agreed? Ontario, Newfoundland, and BC. All the other provinces said no. Yukon, Nunavut, and the Northwest Territories did not respond. Am I correct? I would have to check the notes. Well, I'm looking at them. They're your documents. I know you don't have them with you. You weren't prepared to answer those questions. You said so earlier. I didn't say I wasn't prepared to answer any questions. Yes, you're right. It was about something else. Yes, I would never say that I am not prepared to answer your questions. I have a lot of respect for your wisdom and your intelligence. That's why I was surprised that you didn't remember. But how is it that after a consultation, after a situation like what Senator Carignan described, that nobody was left in the streets, the blockades had been dismantled, what was in that legal opinion? What in the world was in there for you to decide to invoke the act? I'm very comfortable with the decision. My goodness.
Madame la Présidente, mon collègue avait quelque chose d'extraordinaire à
My colleague had something incredible to say. I would love to hear something incredible. I just wanted to say that the decision that was made to declare a state of emergency was conferred by a vote in the House of Commons, which was also the decision made by the Prime Minister.
Mr. Varani, you identified that the government of Canada is the client. Who's the solicitor?
I'm the solicitor as well as the people that assist me.
Or
my office.
And you're also part of government.
That is correct.
You're in cabinet.
That is correct.
Yes, so you're both the client and the solicitor.
I wear different hats at different times in this context.
I remember the S&C, the details of the S&C-Lavalin affair well when a previous Attorney General made a very clear distinction that there is some significant challenges about being both the client and the solicitor, and yet your testimony here today is that the sacrosanct feature is to protect the relationship, but the government has a long history of waiving competent confidence. So how do you defend that when most, as my understanding, of the legislation that provided you with public interest immunity weighed the balance of the protection of government information with the public interest? Having spent so much time on this committee, would you not agree that it is within the public interest to provide the most amount and the highest level of transparency and accountability to the Canadian public, given the fact that the purpose of us being here is on one of the most extreme points of legislation, namely the Emergency Act, sir? So being both the client and the solicitor, please explain to me and the public how you justify not providing basic information in the general public interest.
So let me clarify something. I think it's important for Canadians watching to understand that the Minister of Justice constantly provides, as the Chief Law Officer of the Crown, advice to Cabinet and to government.
I didn't ask for that clarification, and the round is mine.
That is my job.
I need you to actually answer the question I put to you.
I'm trying to answer the question, Mr.
We don't need a history lesson. I want you to answer the question I put to you.
So it is possible for the Minister of Justice to wear different hats around the Cabinet table. That's the first point. The second point, sir, is that I don't agree with your assertion that Cabinet confidence is regularly waived. I know of very few instances, actually, that it has ever been waived. And in terms of ensuring transparency with this process, I'm trying to provide you with as forthcoming information as possible. You've been provided with what is effectively similar to a charter statement. You've been provided with information from the previous Deputy Minister, François Dague. We are assisting you as best as possible without
that suffices.
The important
with my 20 seconds left, I would put to you that the average person watching who heard you talk about the sacrosanct relationship with yourself will not be willing to accept the answers that you've provided here today. And ultimately, I don't think further the public interest of the investigation that we're trying to do. Thank you.
Senator Harder.
Madam Chair, can I respond to that?
My time's up.
Time is up. Senator Harder.
Minister, let me donate the first part of my time to your response.
I think the Canadians that are watching right now in response to Mr. Green would appreciate that the Chief Law Officer of the Crown takes very seriously the issue of how the administration of justice unfolds in this country, and protecting solicitor-client privilege is something that I'm duty-bound to do, not just as Minister, not just as Attorney General, but in terms of my oath to the bar.
My question is for Director Viano. When you were here last, you talked about the emerging threats and the changing threat profile. Could you comment further in terms of the elapsing 2 years as to whether the trends that you forecast are altering, and if so, in what way? And what should we as parliamentarians be concerned about in the area of public safety and security and racially motivated and religiously sponsored terrorism?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Senator Arthur, unfortunately, my answer will not be a very positive one. What we have seen in the last 2 years is an increase in violent extremism in our country, both motivated by ideology but also by religious motives. And that has accelerated also since October the 7th, the attack by Hamas on Israel. So we have, unfortunately, here in Ottawa, we've had, a terrorist plot that was thwarted because of the work of CSIS, the RCMP. And so from an extremism point of view, we have seen a rise in religiously motivated violent extremism. We also have seen what was the concern during the convoy, the ideological motivation continue to increase, both in terms of its people who are motivated against, so anti-government motivation. We have seen an increase in that. We have seen people who have continued to engage in planning, in prepping for activities, doing military-type drills.
Do you have the adequate authority and resources to respond to that increased activity?
So we have been working with the government and with Minister LeBlanc to provide advice on potential changes that would be required. And I'm not sure if the minister has views on that for the committee tonight, but there is indeed a lot of work being done to make sure that we all have the right tools at our disposal. And I would just maybe add, in terms of foreign interference, we have continued to see an increase, and there is a commission of inquiry underway that will hopefully provide Canadians and House of Commons and the Senate, with some perspective on how the threat has continued to evolve and essentially make it more difficult for Canadians here.
And Minister LeBlanc, will that be part of your announcements of next week?
Through you, Madam Chair, Senator Harder, no. The specific resourcing of CSIS, for example, or some of the statutes, particularly the CSIS Act that's 40 years old, as some parliamentarians know as well as I do, is legislation that we think might be modernized to reflect the threat profile the director just referred to. As you may know, we announced consultations in the fall around looking at modernizing the CSIS Act, so that will be a separate parliamentary process, obviously, with the Senate and the House of Commons. But we as a government, and based on the advice of the Commissioner and the Director, recognize that the threat picture and the threat landscape is evolving in a negative way, as the Director said. And our job as a government is to make sure that the security services have all of the resources, including legislative and regulatory authorities, to do the work that we ask of them.
Senator Carignan, you have the last round, 3 minutes.
Moi, il y a une question qui m'embête, c'est...
There's something bothering me. Why did you seize the bank accounts of protesters? What was the objective there? And where did you get the idea to do so? I'm trying to imagine in what kind of free and democratic society in the world it is possible for the authorities to seize bank accounts for protesters.
There was a freezing for a temporary period of time in the assets that were then unfrozen.
OK. Donc, à quel endroit on freeze ou on gèle des...
So where are bank accounts frozen, which means that people can't actually spend the money in their bank accounts? So you're removing their goods for a period of time. Where is this done with no judicial authorization for the sole reason that those individuals are protesting in the streets?
I think, Senator Carignan, after 2 years on this committee, I think you probably know the answer to your own question, that we were dealing with a situation where there were unlawful and illegal activities, where people were being financed, including from Bitcoin sources, et cetera, including from foreign sources. So the idea was to destabilize the illegal blockade by cutting off its finances, which is effectively exactly what happened.
OK, donc c'était ça l'objectif. Comme le ministre...
So that was the goal, as Minister Lametti told us. It was to pull the rug out from under them.
Those were not my words.
OK. Donc le but, c'était de faire une pression économique, empêcher de faire...
So the goal was to put economic pressure on these people to stop them from buying groceries, paying into their health insurance, and get them out of the streets?
Not the characterization that I would put on it. The objective was to ensure that those who were funding the continued illegal blockade of this and other cities were no longer able to do so.
OK. Donc, vous n'avez pas répondu à ma question.
So you didn't answer my first question. In which other democratic country is it possible to do that?
Democratically passed legislation in this country pursuant to the Emergencies Act in Canada.
OK, donc vous avez fait le droit, là. Vous vous êtes inspiré de la Corée du Nord?
So what, were you inspired by North Korea for this?
No. I'm not going to respond to that type of question, Madam Chair.
Non, mais de quel pays vous êtes inspiré?
No, but where did you get your inspiration? Mr. Carignan.
Need to consult the statutes that are in the statutes of Canada, the revised statutes of Canada. I'm sure you're perfectly aware that a bill called the Emergencies Act was passed by the Conservative government around 1987, 1988. In fact, I remember sitting on this committee with you and Perrin Beatty testified to the passage of that very law. It is pursuant to that law in this country that we enacted the declaration.
Senator Carignan, your time is up. 3 minutes, you're up. On behalf, order. On behalf of the Joint Committee, I would like to sincerely thank our witnesses for taking the time to appear before us this evening. Honorable colleagues, members of Parliament, guests, this concludes our public hearing. Does the committee wish to go in camera? No? No? Do you wish to adjourn? Adjourn? Meeting's adjourned.